Welcome to Mystara for the longest video, the compilation of the 1030 timeline that I created not too long ago. I promised to release all of them as one huge video for people that wanted to listen to the video on long drives, or just have something in the background for a few hours. A promise is a promise. So enjoy listening to me rewrite the world and destroy part of the new 5e setting. I'm Mr. Welch, and prepare to fast forward. I will address each nation's changes in history in release order, as that's easiest for me. That means we are starting with the Kingdom of Karameikos, now ruled over by Queen Adriana, as her parents died of natural causes a few years back. King Stefan was a good king and was grieved by Traladarn and Thaetian alike when he passed in his sleep at 76. Adriana was well prepared for her ascent and has ruled capably during the few years she has reigned. She is a widow. Her husband Devon was the minister of the navy who was lost at sea during a particularly fierce storm. She has two sons, Lucian, the crown prince, and Argent. She did cause a bit of a scandal when she struck up a relationship with the Ethengar ambassador Subutai, a friend from her youth, after her husband's death. Karameikos has prospered since the wars. It has survived largely intact, suffering briefly from a blockade before the Irendi fleet was unleashed on the master's pitiful excuse for a navy. Because of this, the merchants grew rich, supplying trade routes and raw materials to help Thyatis, Darrakan, and the Five Shires rebuild. The primary point of contention in the nation is still between the ruling Karameikos family and the von Hendriks, though now the tension lies in the grown-up children. Ludwig von Hendriks was slain fighting humanoids when his strength finally failed him in old age. His son Frederick has become the new count, and while he lacks his father's martial talent, his skill in blackmail and espionage benefited him greatly. Adriana has appointed her brother Justin to serve as the Minister of Finance, a position he has excelled at. He's always had a head for numbers, and under his guidance, the kingdom's coffers have swelled. The quick-witted Valan Karameikos was appointed to be the ambassador to Thyatis, a crucial position considering the strained relationship between the once closely allied nations. Their shared history, desire to repair their strained relationship, and Valan's natural charm has returned the two countries to friendly terms, but not as symbiotic as they once were. The two remaining children of the von Hendriks line have done well for themselves. Amelie married an adventurer who claimed the Maryland estate when the elderly curmudgeon died under mysterious circumstances. The culprit was never found, but considering the list of people who didn't want to see her dead consisted of approximately 3 gnomes who hadn't heard of her, nobody really complained. The adventurer died a decade later of plague, leaving the matron of the von Hendriks clan in power near the capital. Otto von Hendriks, surprisingly, is the peacemaker between the two families due to his natural skill in military matters. The youngest von Hendriks served in the kingdom's armed forces during his shearing, and acquitted himself well during his service at Castellon Keep. He has little patience for people he considers soft, but is a father to his men when they impress him. Adriana appointed him Minister of Defense as a peace offering between the two families, and this gamble has paid off. Otto provides for his troops, though his stern demeanor for those who have never served in the army is off-putting to other ministers. He butts heads with Justin Karameikos quite often, as Justin considers Otto a bully, while Otto considers the finance minister as naive to the world outside the city walls. Other events in Karameikos have seen Master Terrari become the Minister of Magic, though he plans to retire in a few years to finish his quest for immortality. He's one of Adriana's most trusted advisors, and it was his idea to play Otto and Justin off of each other. He thinks their competition drives them both to improve the lives of the citizens. The Radu family finally fell after the death of Anton Radu. His grandsons tried to keep the Veiled Society going, but didn't have Anton's experience or gift of subterfuge. Eventually, the family was exposed and finally put down. The religious split threatened with Patriarch Jowet's death never manifested. Alfred Oderbree's attempted coup was stopped early when his followers blanched at the thought of bloodshed between members of the faith. The cult of Halav has largely faded into memory with the death of King Stefan. He's still well regarded with certain members of the clergy, but the organized worship of him has stopped. As far as Bargle goes, he's still out there somewhere being Bargle. The conflicts you're going to find in 2030 Karameikos are primarily internal. Internationally, they're well liked by just about everybody. They've even smoothed over their relations with Thyatis after years of tension. The power struggle remains between the royal family and the von Hendriks, but it's well hidden and behind the scenes. The two remaining significant religions still butt heads frequently, but there's nothing more than just the occasional shouting match. The Iron Ring is mainly extinct, replaced by von Kessler agents who prefer to obtain slaves without resorting to raids. Yularim is a nation coming into its own because of the dedication of Sultan Ahmed ibn Said. He consolidated power after the year of 4 sultans, and he dedicated all of his time trying to return the waters of Yularim. He couldn't restore the rains, as he didn't know that it was magic that stole it from his land in the first place. The elves couldn't be reached for comment. He contracted multiple adventurers to find the underground Nithian River, an expedition that took years. Behind the scenes, he employed numerous high-level wizards, dervishes, and clerics to return the river above ground. If his use of foreign arcane magic had been discovered, he would have been disgracefully overthrown. But with the river now flowing through the mountains past Yularim's city and out into the ocean, Yularis have reacted with pride at this creation, which they accredit to Al-Kalim. The return of the river Nithya has created several unforeseen problems, starting first with Ibn Said stepping down from the Sultanate to quest for immortality. The nation went through several sultans in the next few decades, mostly taking on the position at an advanced age and dying a few years later. The current sultan, Ahmed ibn Fadlan, is a member of the Kin faction and has turned Yularim isolationists while they dedicate all their attentions to infrastructure. In the process, he's had to deal with increased raids from the Nithian tribesmen, Sistik war parties, and reavers coming down from the shattered Solderford Jarldoms. He's also discovered the truth about the creation of the river Nithya, but he hides that from everyone. Ibn Said is considered a lock for immortality by the Yulari, and anyone disparaging him will not be tolerated. The threats facing Yularim are both internal and external. People are more united than ever, but the brigands and humanoids from the deep desert or mountain strongholds are gaining more confidence as the new settlements are harder to defend. There has been an effort made to wipe out the Sistik and drive the Nithians from their homes, but there hasn't been any real threat to them. With the breakup of the Solderford Jarldoms, pirates and reavers are becoming a common sight across a large chunk of the northern coastal region. The wizard Barrymore has seen the river routed right by his project, something that he does not approve of in the slightest. While he hasn't raised his hand at the newcomers, he has set up several landings on the river for merchants shipping goods. He's torn, as he despises visitors, but the merchants are more than happy to pay him a lot of money to provision them before they move on. Glantry has seen the most change of all the nations, having barely avoided a full-blown civil war more than once. It has added a host of new princes, but lost others along the way. They've become even more shunned through their use of magics forbidden in other lands, which has only hurt the poor as the high-level wizards can provide for themselves. Glantry has strained its relationship with Darrakin, but is on friendly terms with Karameikos and Alfheim. There's a very short list of allies, and their list of enemies hasn't narrowed at all since the Wizard War 30 years ago. With the discovery of the Radiance by the Immortals, many of the Brotherhood of Rad have gone into hiding or been slain. One side effect of having the Crucible feed on negative energies was to reduce the length of the day without magic. Every year, the day was shortened by a few minutes from the previous year. As it stands now, the day without magic is barely 4 hours long, an event that Glantrians still dread. Because of the drain, necromantic magic is becoming increasingly more difficult, and the two undead princes haven't been seen in the capital for years. The first Glantrian Civil War nearly occurred during a power struggle between Sin the Night Dragon in her guise as Dolores Hillsbury and her numerous supporters, versus the new Averron faction of Richard and Isidore, with their allies Malachi du Moray and Quinildor Erawan. Sin had used her entropic powers to ensnare Princes von Drachenfell and Di Malapietra, along with her toady High Doge Cole, and were poised to expel the Erawan elves from Glantry, calling for a vote to settle the matter once and for all. Sin's faction won the vote by the narrowest of margins, only for a surprise delegate to appear. The long-missing Etienne d'Amberville returned without any fanfare, simply walking through the door and sitting in his old chair. He then cast his vote in favor of his brother and sister-in-law, changing the result to their position. An outraged Hillsbury called Etienne an impostor and demanded his immediate execution. D'Amberville countered this by casting a spell, forcing Hillsbury to assume her true form, that of the Night Dragon Sin. This shocked a great deal of the assembled delegates, who in the space of a few minutes had seen the return of the most powerful Glantrian prince, and the revelation of Sin's actual nature. Before anyone could react, Sin lunged in all of her draconic fury at Etienne, who cast another spell, exploding the dragon all over Parliament and its delegates. This threw Glantry into absolute chaos as the power balance of the nation shifted with a single spell. Most of Sin's closest allies claimed to have no knowledge of her true form and were offered a chance to step down from their positions in exchange for leniency. Except for High Doge Cole, who was set upon by the werewolves, who were led by the elven Lord Quinildor. Sigmund von Drachenfels took over for his father and moved Ritterberg's focus away from dragons and more into artifice. The boy was well known for lacking skill in building magic devices, so a not small cadre of gnomes were hired to instruct him further. Prince Di Malapietra consulted with his family to decide who was the most qualified to take over control of the province. Due to a slight miscalculation on the waiter over which goblin wasn't poisoned, when the first toast was done, the prince, his brothers Giovanni and Augustina, and his sister Lucretia were found face down on the table, with only his 12-year-old son Bartolomeo alive. There was a significant juggling of seats due to the sudden death or abdication of many princes and nobility. Bartolomeo was raised by his mother with the help of Antonio di Taranto, a family ally and alleged member of the Pragmati. Despite the boy's young age and the lethal history of his family, he survived into adulthood as any potential rivals developed a rather strange habit of dying in an unexpected yet plausibly deniable fashion. This isn't to say Corinth is a safe place to do politics. If you weren't the prince or his inner council, your odds of surviving to old age have not improved. With Sin dead, Black Hill was left without a prince for the second time in less than a decade. With both of the deceased Prince Volospin's children underage and politically isolated because of the machinations of Sin, the position was offered to Count Ameth Erbal, a longtime ally of House Silverstone. The new prince is more obsessed with air magics than running his new domain. Still, he delegates well and is popular with the rest of Parliament, simply because he has little political interest outside his studies. Volospin's two children both covet the throne despite their young age, and are looking for ways to send the new prince plummeting from the sky. On accident, of course. The two undead princes both suffered greatly, with the crucible now draining negative energy to power it. This heavily impacted Prince MacGregor because of his use of the Radiance, something Prince Volosny didn't do. Both princes were also steadfast opponents of the policy allowing clerics in the Glantry to deal with the undead menace caused during the war with Alphatia, where the necromantic princes were unleashing hordes of undead to try to turn back the Alphatian monsters and the various rebel groups that were empowered by the war. MacGregor disappeared one night without warning. There was a loud boom, and when his guards broke down his magically sealed door, they found signs of an explosion, but no MacGregor. Prince Volosny, a month later, was found slain on top of his tower with his head cut from his shoulders and a stake through his heart. There are no suspects officially, but the next day at noon, Claude d'Amberville appeared in the town square of Igorov, calling on its population to throw down their undead lords. With the death or disappearance of two more Glantrian princes, the nation almost broke into another civil war. In the case of Brandt MacGregor, he left explicit instructions in case of his death or disappearance that his grandson Angus would become the prince, despite Angus being underage. He is helped by his two uncles, who try to influence the boy to become a better ruler than Branart, but Angus stopped being a child years ago. Interestingly enough, the clerics trying to clean up the undead problem in Clantyr have felt a great disturbance. Omens and portents indicate a new player in the heavens who is yet to reveal himself. The death of Prince Morfel Gorovich Voslazny left a massive power vacuum in Moldavia, as his undead thralls found themselves free to claim the princedom for themselves. It hasn't helped that the newly restored Claude d'Amberville has led a force of paladins into the province looking for undead. Claude's wife Titania was freed from Volosny's control and begged her husband to restore her humanity, as his family did for him. Claude used all of his influence to convince his father to wish his wife back to life, and now he's on a rampage of revenge against his former masters. When the flames died down, the cruel Mikhail Voslazny was the last vampire standing. The rest of the principalities are relatively stable compared to the turmoil of the ones just mentioned. Kandahar remained neutral, but pounced when Ritterberg was disgraced because of their involvement with Sin. Because of this, they created the Principality of Skullhaven, with Ermahid Krinagar as the new prince. Likewise, House Alhambra took advantage of the death of Prince Velarden to have Donna de Montebello named Princess of Oxhill. The fourth principality was given to Harold Hoskins, who was given Sablestone on pure merit, a rarity in Glantrian politics. Prince Carlotino joined House Salaire to reward Malachi du Marais for opposing Sin with the last of the new principalities, Morlaix. It is known he is a werewolf and is allowed to rule without interference as other lycanthropes flock to the new domain where they won't be hunted indiscriminately. Etienne's return, as outlined in the module Mark of Amber, has turned Glantrian politics on its ear, but he's happy to sit quietly in his chair and watch the deadly politics take place around him. Glantry was always known for its internal strife, and it's only gotten worse. Sin is dead, but Erewhon still lies half-raised by the humanoid attacks. Half the princes are dead or deposed, and the new leaders range from out of their element to worse than their predecessors. There's 5 new principalities, many of whom serve as second votes for their sponsoring house. No one outside of Glantry trusts the mages, and for good measure. The nation hasn't changed to what it is. They are still the same backstabbing, xenophobic, pragmatic wizards. It's just now they're under new management. And 15 princes can argue amongst each other much better than 10 princes. Irendi has reached its crossroads. The island nation tried to avoid joining the wars on the mainland, but the collective conscience of its people just couldn't stand by and watch the slaughter. Unleashing their ships turned the tide of the War of the Master, allowing troops to land behind Julian forces, cut supply lines, and liberate cities. The hybrid of former pirates and Toa Makai made for a frightening sight on the battlefield. When the war was over, the nation had to stop and think about its next step. They couldn't remain isolationists. Either they would be drawn into the larger war because they were a threat, or they couldn't stand back and watch their allies suffer. Irendi decided, after much debate, to do what they could to make the seas safer, not just for their ships, but for all nations. They have started patrols to hunt down humanoid raiders, especially the Karakara, and purge them from the various tropical islands. Piracy has become much rarer because of the Irendi patrols. A general amnesty was offered in the nation for pirates before the nations hunted down the various offenders. A week after the country made its offer for any pirate to give up a life of a buccaneer, a massive fleet of pirate ships arrived in Mad Cree's Cove outside of Irendi City. Every alarm was sounded and the guard was roused, but then the most unexpected thing happened. The pirates surrendered. They claimed amnesty and offered to become privateers for the nation. The fleet accounted for over 90% of the pirates operating in the country. The offer was accepted, and their first task was to hunt down the remaining 10% that didn't take the amnesty. Irindi's biggest concern was unifying its people into a single nation. Refugees had flooded into Irindi after the war, as it was one of the few nations untouched by it. They were largely content with their diversity, but the new immigrants caused several incidents that threatened the harmony. After much debate and negotiation, Honor Island agreed to give up its sovereignty and become a single people. Multiple concessions were made, and the island was still perilous if you weren't native to it because of all the fire-related creatures. It's considered private property, but now contributed to the defense of Irindi officially. There's a bit of unease with the creatures that arrive from the island unannounced currently. Still, the first time orc raiders were repulsed by a trio of fire giants serving in the nation's army, everybody realized the arrangement could work. Irindi has spent the last 3 decades unifying its people to work together as Irindi. They were no longer former convicts, Makai, dwarves, Honor Islands, halfling refugees or albinos, or even the newly arrived Sind, Darrican, and Etrugan refugees. But they were the Irindi. Multiple agreements have been made to gain the full support of all the different people, and now they have to take part in the nation. The Irindi Council now includes a single representative of the albinos of Utter Island, along with a dwarven spokesman. The refugees and their descendants were given cursory representation as well. Only the cursed White Island isn't represented for apparent reasons. Irindi doesn't have a lot of issues as a nation. They're trying to be a player abroad with their anti-pirate monster patrols, but have no imperial thoughts, and they're on good terms with every country with a port. Internally, their primary issues are economic ones. With the rise of the trading powers of Vestland and Salishan, Irindi's resort industry is becoming taxed with the number of visitors. The nation realizes there can be too much of a good thing. Especially after the war, many refugees have tried to settle in the islands, which put a strain on the nation's resources. Decades later, there is still some resentment for the refugees who arrived, claiming the war destroyed their homes, but when their country was rebuilt, they decided to stay. The War of the Master and the internal strife in Glantry have dramatically impacted Alfheim. While the elven homeland didn't see any of the Master's troops step foot in their forest, they fought in multiple battles and lost quite a few men in the war's later stages. They expected compensation from Darrican, but with the devastation brought on by the Master's forces, the elves realized that that wasn't coming anytime soon. But what concerns them the most is the nation of New Angmor that has claimed the Broken Lands. Despite being neighbors for decades now, the Sylvan elves still don't trust their Shadow Elf cousins, and the feeling is mutual. What makes matters worse is the Canalbarth and the Angmor Forest drew closer to each other despite the best efforts of both elven nations, and now cover the Inlashar region of Darrican. The trees don't intermingle. When you cross from the green trees to the blue trees, you've entered the other forest. While there hasn't been any open conflict between the elves, a few raids have taken place by both sides to test each other's mettle. Deaths are rare on these raids. It's more of a show of force than an actual force. Both sides are treated like bandits if caught, but even then they're more likely to be ransomed than lynched. King Doriath stepped down after 200 years of rule to pursue his quest for immortality. It's rumored that his immortal patron gave him an ultimatum, and the Elf King decided that he served his nation long enough. Doriath has just recently stepped down. He's been pondering the decision for decades after the return of the Shadow Elves. He's yet to pick a successor, as there are numerous candidates, but none stand out from the others. Whoever he chooses must be brought up to speed on the diplomatic Cold War between the elves before they even look at the throne. While the elves are insular, their entire attention has been devoted across the Insular to their cousins. Attitudes range from optimism for Clan Chosa merchants to outright hatred for the militant Clan Red Arrow. Relations are cool, but there is some conversation. Darrican doesn't want a total war going on with them in the crossfire. King Doriath has met multiple times with Queen Tanadelio to try to improve relations. It doesn't help that these two can barely stand each other. He thinks that she has eyes for his throne. She sees him as a Darrican puppet. It would probably be better for all involved to let diplomats handle the negotiations, but the elven rulers refuse to delegate this task. The dwarves of Rockholm have mixed feelings about the war, as the only thing that got them involved was Darrican's gold. Lots of Darrican's gold. Every dwarf trained to swing an axe fought in the war as a mercenary. None did it out of loyalty to their ally. Rockholm's army acquitted itself well in multiple battles, but took heavy losses towards the war's end as they held the center against the Master. Despite Darrican filling King Everest's coffers for the use of the dwarven troops, many dwarven leaders didn't feel like this was their problem. The Master's armies would smash against the walls of Karok Castle, as the orcs did long ago at the Battle of Sardal Pass. The wealth earned from the war served Rockholm well, at least for a while. The army recovered its losses quickly, and Rockholm paid its soldiers bonuses to join. Engineers built new roads and renovated dams to increase water flow to power the forges. Everything was going wonderfully in the caverns of the dwarves, but the devastation of the war slowly caught up with the craftsmen and the merchants. No one could buy their goods in large numbers. Typically, Rockholm sold excess goods to Darrican, but the nation of Coin was half-leveled. Alfheim was more concerned about dealing with the Shadow Elves than maintaining relations with other countries. While Vestland was an emerging economic power, they preferred different markets. The Rockholm economy started to stagnate. Internally, doubts began to crop up around King Everast and his leadership. He was considering allowing the craftsmen to seek work outside of Rockholm, but the problem was dwarven pride was pricing their work out of the market. Dwarves were superior carpenters and masons, but towns burned to the ground don't have the gold to hire them. The nation was wealthy, but all that extra gold was useless because there was nothing to buy. The Herwarf clan leaders, Durik and Bifia, decided it was time for the repossessed to move on to the throne. The rise of Falun gave them that chance. When the gnomes retook their homeland, they pushed out tens of thousands of kobolds. One of the gnomish inventions caused a massive earthquake felt as far away as the dwarven capital of Dengar. The Trimmer opened a sealed passage and released the still-living King Dinwarf, the first king of Rockholm. This ancient being was the first dwarf, the one Kagiar created to lead the race at its creation. Dinwarf announced to all that he was reclaiming his throne, which King Everast opposed. Clan Herwarf threw its support behind their founder Dinwarf, along with several other clans, and Rockholm found itself in a civil war. King Thar took advantage of the conflict and the sudden expulsion of kobolds and other humanoids from the area to raise a new army and march on Karok Castle. The dwarven troops set aside their differences and pushed the humanoids back. Still, the kings realized they were equally matched in the field and decided to settle the civil war with a combat of champions rather than tear the nation apart as the armies ground themselves to dust. The king and their champions met on the field of honor in the battle to the death. Everast proved to be no match for the first dwarf, who makes quick work of the Everast champions, leaving only Everast and his son Boffin remaining. But before Dinwarf can finish the wounded king, he goes mad, turning on his own forces. He killed half his remaining champions before Prince Boffin and the remaining Dinwarf champions could put down the insane usurper. In the following minutes, King Everast XV died of his wounds, and the surviving Herwarf champions swore fealty to Boffin. The civil war was over. For their part in the civil war, Durik and Bifia, the Herwarf clan leaders, were sentenced to exile, where they were both given a small garden and little else to do for the rest of their lives. Boffin breaks with tradition and takes the name Boffin I instead of Everest XVI. He is a capable king, though a dour one at times. The dwarves foolishly hoarded their gold in the post-war strife and squandered it in their civil war. He sends the craftsmen and the laborers to the other lands to help with the rebuilding at a fraction of the average dwarven rates. This greatly helps speed up the restoration of Darrican, and other nations like Karameikos, Athengar, or Vestland welcome the dwarves. The Hins still want nothing to do with them, much less the Glantrians. Boffin I is a capable king and recognizes problems before they become emergencies. He is known as the Grim King due to his nature. He rarely smiles, even to his advisors. He treats every issue facing him with the same focused attention. A minor flood is treated with the same urgency as an orc invasion. He's a difficult ruler to understand, as he reacts with the same stone-faced expression to good news as to bad. He's not a popular king, but he's a respected one. The dwarves might not like him, but they do appreciate his ability to get things done. The fate of the northern nations is a mixed one, from great success to absolute failure. Vestland took its newfound popularity with the western countries, and used it to further their transition from a nation built on war and raiding to a more mercantile one. They'd always been known for their skill at crafts, but now with the fall of Darrican and the isolation of Minrathad, they had a captive market. Vestland goods were snatched up by the Ethengar, with their newfound wealth looted from the Master's army. Wood and stone goods arrived in other nations through caravans and ships as fast as they could be loaded. King Harold was quick to capitalize on the opportunity the war presented. Vestland spent the Darrican gold paid to supply troops for paving roads, building merchantmen, and modernizing its docks. Soon Vestlandic goods were pouring into Darrican, Yalarum, Thyatis, and beyond. With the fall of Ostland to Thyatis, Vestland found itself the most powerful of the northern reaches. Life was good for the new merchant power. Then events from outside their borders hit like a hammer. The first conflict was the war with Minrathad. Vestland discovered the hard way what happens if you try to encroach upon Minrathad waters, as several of their ships were attacked and seized. Pirates began to target Vestlandic merchant ships as soon as they passed Thyatis waters. The war started when King Harold laid a trap. A pair of pirate ships set upon a Vestlandic merchantman coming out of Vanya's girdle. The Strait of Water, not the Immortals' actual undergarments. When the ship was boarded, the pirates discovered the actual cargo. A couple of hundred Vestlandic warriors. Pirates might be hardened killers, but they were no match for several dozen frothing Northmen. The Vestlanders captured both ships and found the captains to be privateers in service to Minrathad. The long-lingering trade war of the known world had just turned hot. Vestland sent out raiders for the first time in a century, all headed south towards the guilds. The Minrathad-Vestland war only lasted 6 months, as the nation spent little of it fighting on land. Merchant ships were the primary target. The distance between the two countries meant an actual occupying force was impractical. The Vestlanders found unusual allies with the undersea nation of Seaholm, who had little love for the Northmen but a burning hatred for Minrathad. Other ships joined the Vestlanders, coming from Karameikos, the Shires, and even Irendi. The tipping point of the war was the Battle of Harbor Town, where half a dozen Vestlandic longships slipped into the harbor undetected through the use of magic. The target was the docks, along with the warehouses and ships found there, and the city of Minroth could see the fires that night nearly 50 miles away. Minroth had sued for peace. They still had the numbers to fight, but they didn't have the will without allies. Wars are expensive, after all. Irendi worked out the peace accord, where both sides would avoid each other's ports, but leave the other shipping alone. The treaty forced Vestland to avoid Minrathad waters, meaning either they hug the coast or they swing wide south. Minrathad could not sail north of Thyattis unless they headed to the Isle of Dawn. Vestland didn't have the political power to get concessions, but their victory established them as a trading power. One that might not have the most money, but one that could defend itself far better than its competitors. The second event that impacted Vestland was the fall of Solderfjord. With the splintering of the Jarls and the invasion of King Thar, Vestland absorbed many refugees fleeing their southern neighbor. King Harald took in as many as he could and pressed the fighting men arriving into service to protect the merchants and build an army that could hold back Thar's legions if it moved north. Vestland's newly acquired wealth has been redirected partially to its military modernization. Landers Fjord is one of the most heavily fortified borders in the known world, with the Vestland side buttressed by dwarven-built fortresses, the finest weapons and armor the Vestlanders could craft, and gnomish-built war machines ready to unleash hell if Thar tries to cross the river. It's a massive drain on resources, but the alternative is unthinkable. King Harald II now rules Vestland and has learned much from his father's wisdom. It's a wealthy nation in 1030, though not as powerful as the rebuilt Darrican or Minrathad. They're known for their quality products, fast caravans, and their ability to defend their goods better than anyone else. The treaty with Minrathad still holds, but now Vestland wants to expand its territory. It has reached the Isle of Dread, and has several colonies dotting the coast on that faraway island. They've even begun trading with Alphatia, though the wizards still distrust the Northerners because of the Ostlandic actions during the war. Ostland remained a nation occupied for decades. When the Heldonic Knights conquered the poorly defended country during the War of the Wizard, Thyattis made a point of liberating their allies. Or at least everybody thought they did. Emperor Eusebius took the opportunity to land even more troops on Ostland to try and threaten Norwald. Then the Ostlanders realized they were not going to be a free nation anymore. King Hord Dark-Eyed died suddenly on his longship off the Isle of Dawn coast, never seeing his nation again after the war. The crown fell to his oldest son, Finn Hordson. He was a puppet of the Thyatian Empire, but his mother taught him how to play their lethal games. Finn cooperated with the Thyatian governor and worked with them to put down insurrections or revolts before they happened. In return, the Thyatians left Finn to run the nation. As long as the tribute poured in and the Ostlandic auxiliary never lacked troops, Finn was allowed to run the government as he saw fit. Under his mother's guidance, he modernized his nation. He learned to fake a crisis to get more aid from the Thyatians. 10 years into the occupation, he had the reputation of being a timid yet loyal member of the empire. The king was far from it. His mother taught him to play along to get what they wanted. In the first decade with him as king, he saw Thyatian soldiers pave every road in Ostland as mere make-busy work. Ostlandic raids were permitted, but only under a false flag and against a target favorable to Thyattis. Fortunately, Solderfjord and Norwald had plenty of targets. Many of Finn's rivals viewed him as a weak figurehead, but he was playing the long game. Thyattis had tens of thousands of soldiers stationed in Ostland. They were organized and they were happy to be in what they thought was an easy post, though they did complain about the cold. If anyone made life hard on them, then their laid-back attitudes would change. Finn planned to keep the Thyatians fat, happy, and lazy. In return, they would rubber stamp his decisions. His first test was from his brother Geir. The younger brother of Hord believed in following the old ways, even though Thyattis was well established in Ostland. Most men of fighting age had been pressed into military service, leaving Geir few that could overthrow the occupiers, and even fewer of prime age. Still, he insisted, and despite his brother's dire warnings, moved on the Thyatian governor. The Thyatians crushed the revolt in a single night. Despite the family bonds, Finn personally signaled the headsman to execute his brother. This impressed Emperor Eusebius even further, who responded by reducing the Thyatian garrison and giving Finn Darkeye even more autonomy. It took 20 years, but Ostland finally regained a degree of independence due to the Alphatian Civil War. The conflict between the followers of Prince Xandor and Crown Princess Arafne spilled over its borders into the Isle of Dawn and parts of Norwald. Thyattis, wary of intervening, was finally forced when Xandor's assassins attempted to murder Eusebius's children in retaliation for Thyattis offering Prince Tridorian refuge during the war. Eusebius had no feelings for Ariadne's youngest son, but Tridorian did spend several years in Thyattis as a hostage, and he was a politically useful tool. Thyattis ordered its ships to attack Xandor's troops where they could be found. Finn offered to lead the Ostlandic auxiliary personally, which Thyattis gave him as an afterthought. Eusebius didn't even realize what he was signing when presented with the request. Finn had one shot, and that was to earn an imperial boon. Rather than relying on a frontal assault that the Alphatians were waiting for, he took a dozen hand-picked men and a merchant ship flying false colors. Posing as a newly formed Veslandic trading cartel, he used every bit of his diplomatic skills to butter up Prince Xandor to gain access to Aquis. Finn wagered that the vain Alphatian prince could not tell the difference between a Veslandic accent and an Ostlandic accent, and would be too busy obsessing over all the free tribute being presented to him. And he was correct. The Alphatians were expecting an attack from the air or a magical assault by wizards, not a tiny handful of supposed Veslandic merchants. Finn played up the part and offered up barrel after barrel of mead to the prince, each barrel containing a more robust vintage. Xandor's hubris got the better of them, and he wanted to hear more of the silver-tongued Finn's tales. Finn toasted the prince, the guards, and everyone in the room and emptied barrel after barrel of mead. The revelry distracted everyone so much that they never noticed how clumsy the Ostlanders were, as they kept spilling every bit of their drink after their first few mugs. When the Thaiatian fleet approached Aquis, they intercepted a merchant ship flying Veslandic colors. On board was King Finn, his small band of men, and a very well-bound, gagged, and hungover Xandor. While the Alphatians had vaporized each other with magics, Finn ended the war by targeting Xandor's biggest weakness, his oversized ego. The story behind Finn's great victory grew with every telling until the legend of the king, who drained an entire barrel of mead in a single gulp to best the Emperor of Alphatia in a drinking contest to the death, finally reached the ears of Eusebius. The Emperor didn't believe the stories he was hearing. Still, when Finn handed over Xandor without a single drop of blood spilled, even the laconic Emperor couldn't contain his admiration. Eusebius offered Finn an imperial boon, and like Duke Stefan Karameikos decades earlier, Finn asked for complete autonomous control of Ostland. The Emperor was impressed with the Ostlanders' gumption. King Finn had done his homework. Some provisions in boring economic rules involving tariffs and port fees were required, but Ostland was free again. When Finn returned home, the legends had already reached his people. They didn't believe it until the morning before their king returned. The Thaiatians just got on their ships and left. King Finn Darkeye of Ostland returned to thunderous applause and a nation ready to return to the world stage. Where Vestland had prospered and Ostland was reborn, Solderfjord is a shattered remnant of the nation. The loosely allied Jarls never really changed. Ragnar the Stout became the High King because of the war raging around his country. The nobles grudgingly accepted, and he got the army ready for battle to reach Solderfjord. While Thaiatis and Alphatia's wrath hit nations around Solderfjord, the conflict never reached their shores. Ragnar wasn't done being king when the war was over. He started trying to unify the Jarls and expand Solderfjord's influence to surrounding areas. Thaiatis was weakened, Ostland was conquered, and Norwald was left unprotected for large areas. Solderfjord's time was now. Or it would have been if the Jarls didn't Jarl. Ragnar never saw his dreams come true. With the emergency gone, the reason behind his rule was over, according to his detractors. A few of his rivals died of mysterious causes, a common happening when Solderfjord's politics turned heated. When Ragnar had Jarl Gunthorm Brittlebone executed for an unauthorized attack on the Vestlandic town of Bjornbank that left dozens dead, the other Jarls had had enough. In a bloody battle, Ragnar was ambushed on the road by forces of Jarls allied against him. Both sides were practically annihilated in the clash, but Ragnar the Stout's rule ended on the road to Castellan. Ragnar's death was traumatic, as Jarl fought Jarl out of revenge, outstanding feuds, or to be the next war chief. Thousands died in pointless battles, and Vestland, Thaiatis, and Yalarum fortified their borders to prevent the slaughter from spilling over. After several years, the latest in another Solderfjord civil war ground to a halt as the petty nobles were too tired to fight anymore. But the damage had been done. Solderfjord had condemned itself because of its Jarl's selfishness. Deep in the Hardanger Mountains, an incalculable number of kobolds happily occupied the empty caverns of the once great gnomish nation Falun. They occasionally ventured out to raid nearby human settlements, but not enough to earn a unified response. Elsewhere around Solderfjord were numerous gnoll camps with giants and trolls also in good numbers. They were a nuisance but never a grave threat. 2 battles changed that. The Second Battle of Sardal Pass saw the exiled Orc King Thar try and storm Castle Karok to reach the interior of Rockholm. This attack unified the warring dwarves. Rather than smash his ragtag army against the walls of the dwarven castle, Thar instead withdrew to the east. He still had tens of thousands left over from his legion of old, and picked up reinforcements from the various humanoid tribes he encountered. In comparison, his numbers weren't enough to threaten the whole nation, but that was only a temporary problem. The kobolds of Hardanger had lived in their caves and in the fallen gnomish cities for centuries. Then one day in 1015, the kobolds were interrupted by a single large canister launched into one of the largest cave openings. Out of the canister spewed a poison gas that killed all it touched. Following the canister were numerous constructs, along with gnomes in special suits of armor that protected them from the gas. The retaking of Falun had begun. The kobolds were slaughtered en masse. Hundreds of thousands choked and died in the first hour. The gnomes cleaned out every cave with poison, fire, and fell machines they'd spent all those years in exile constructing. The supreme symposium of gnomish syndicates had come in force. Now there was going to be a reckoning. No more waiting, no more preparing, no more mercy. Falun would be retaken, no matter how many had to die on the battle. The kobolds fancied themselves tinkers, but nothing could have prepared them for the onslaught that awaited them. Mechanical dragons incinerated the kobolds that tried to fight. The poison gases reached into every nook and cranny, leaving no survivors. Kobolds were never brave creatures. They quickly broke and ran north into Soderfjord proper. There they were assaulted by gnomish airships that carpet-bombed them into oblivion. Many gnomes thought the slaughter was excessive, but their pleas went ignored. 9 out of 10 kobolds were dead, but tens of thousands escaped, right into Soderfjord. King Thar reached Soderfjord days before the gnomish blitz liberated Falun. He was there to make a deal with the Modrig's work, as he needed an edge to become a threat to the world again. He encountered the fleeing kobolds and made them a deal. Well, an offer. An offer that ended every request with the words, "or else." The kobolds joined his army, and after a brief pause to organize them, Thar launched a full assault into the province of Nordkassel. The defenders only had a population of 8,000. Thar had a force 20 times that. The conquest had begun. The Jarldoms were bled white because of the internal strife. Thar's legion was at full strength because of the kobolds, gnolls, and trolls flocking to his banner. If he'd attacked anywhere else, he could have been stopped, but not in Soderfjord. The towns fought alone, the Jarls moving to protect their lands rather than unifying to stop Thar. Sortfeld fell, then Backwater, then Lerum, and finally the capital of Soderfjord itself. The Jarls tried to unify after Thar sat on the throne of the High King, but it was far too late. Humanoids poured into Soderfjord from their lairs by the tens of thousands. The remaining Soderfjorders were too few and too spread out to put up a serious defense. Finally, Vestland and Yalarum opened up their borders to survivors that could escape by land, and King Finn of Ostland, with Thaetian support, evacuated who he could by sea. Within a year, Soderfjord was no more. The gnomes were quick to establish a government in their liberated homeland. It was technically a kingdom, but the various gnomish syndicates compromised the parliament, which held equal power. The gnomes' gas was targeted towards kobolds. It did minor damage to the subterranean ecosystem by design. The gas broke down in components shortly after being unleashed, leaving a rutabaga-scented sheen that evaporated in a few hours. The gnomes involved in the battle numbered only a few thousand, but they were just the first wave. The gnomish diaspora was over, and soon they flocked to Falun. Other nations were initially thrilled to hear of the tremendous gnomish victory and the establishment of a friendly country in a region known for its hostile population. Rockholm quickly sent an ambassador. Even Yalarum, Theatis, and Karameikos recognized the nation immediately. But rumors started to leak about exactly how the gnomes had won their homeland. A Darrican diplomat wrote back of the kobold dead piled 20 feet high for as far as the eye could see. Sorain's gnomes were initially giddy over the news, resulting in a week-long celebration in the city. But when they flew over the new homeland, they saw the pits of kobolds burning outside the entrances. The smell of the burning corpses permeated the city. The Falun gnomes didn't just drive the kobolds out, they massacred them. The kobold dead reached easily over 1 million. The Falunian gnomes didn't care. The end justified the means. Falun was back, even if it meant Soderfjord had to die. The international response to Falun is guarded. Everybody liked the gnomes, but nobody had any idea what they were truly capable of. All of the surrounding nations wonder what other war crimes the gnomes would be willing to commit to get what they wanted. Nobody wanted the kobolds as neighbors, but gassing an entire civilian population was entirely different. There's also the matter of the various agencies and nations wanting gnomish technology. The military creations are well guarded, but the technological marvels being excavated daily by the gnomes are another matter. There's even a rumor of the gnomes developing an alchemical substance with the same properties as the smoke powder from the Savage Coast. But that's probably just a rumor. The Shires took the most damage from the Master's forces, except for Darrican. They were assaulted by Hulian forces from the south and the Tiger Clan's troops from the west. Southshire was left in ruins, while Hartshire took significant damage as well. The enemy reached as far as the Ithypool River, occupying a third of the nation at the height of the war. Entire clans went missing. Cities were left depopulated. When assistance came in the form of Irindian and Karameikan armies, the bitter fights to reclaim the Shires destroyed many of the villages occupied by the Tiger Clan. The sheriffs realized their current government was too fragmented to act in a national emergency. A new position was created, that of Shire Protector. This executive officer has no political power unless a nationwide emergency is declared, in which case the sheriffs yield power to him. The Protector is named well in advance and is unanimously selected by all sheriffs. When the emergency is over, the Protector's authority returns to the sheriffs, and government reverts to normal. The relevant sheriff will still handle internal disasters, while the others lend a hand as needed. That way there is always just one leader handling emergencies rather than a committee. Another problem that had to be solved was the freelancers that helped the Hen, with mixed results. All eyes were firmly on the draconic lush, Fursdrag, who slaughtered the Master's forces by the thousands and accidentally ruined Hin strategies with his collateral damage. The sheriffs approached numerous high-level adventurers living in the Shires in their retirement to ask them to help coordinate their use against future aggression. The numerous adventurers living in Moon Hill wondered what took so long to think of this, as they had spent their time during the war on one-man missions to fight the Master. The Tall Guard was organized. Any adventurer or similar who wished to defend their adopted homeland must work within the organization, including one very well hungover amber dragon. The Hin rebuilt their nation through their own labors, but with the help of allies when needed. The dead could not be replaced, but settlers from the eastern section of the nation helped repopulate Southshire. Trade with the country of Salishan brought in new foods the Hin couldn't get enough of, and Salish traders were welcome guests at every village in the Shires. The war did have a unique benefit. Raids from Glantry and the Black Eagle Barony ground to a halt due to a lack of viable targets from the wizards, and von Hendrick's personal army being obliterated in the war. The Shires remained peaceful in the following decades, just as they wanted. Minrathad not only survived the wars unscathed, they profited from them. They declared neutrality, pushing their forges, farms, and craftsmen into overdrive. They sold food, weapons, and goods to both sides of the War of the Wizards and the allied forces in the War of the Master. When Thyatis burned the wheat fields of Belissaria, Minrathad ships were on their way to Alphatia with grain. When Thyatis raised multiple auxiliaries, Minrathad armed them. When the continent froze under an ash-blackened sky, Minrathad fed them. For full price, of course, plus shipping, and a convenience fee, and sales tax, plus a transportation fee, and the one more gold piece won't hurt you fee. When the wars were over, the prices stayed high. Minrathad was happy to keep gouging their neighbors for as much as possible. Darrican was half destroyed. Much of the Shire's farmland hadn't recovered. Thyatis made sure to salt the fields of Belissaria. Many nations' economies were starting to crash, but not Minrathad. But after the initial post-war reconstruction, Minrathad noticed a steep drop in demand for their products. Darrican and the Shires still weren't close to recovery, but two new mercantile states had entered the game. Rivals Minrathad wanted gone. Salishan was the name of the new Turtle Clan nation, and through the excellent leadership of their chief and the business acumen of many of their traders, they started to make a name for themselves. Minrathad had previously done business with the Turtle Clan, but now the Etrugan brought their goods to foreign ports rather than selling to international merchants. Usually the Minrathad response would be to infiltrate their rival and perform acts of sabotage or piracy. But the problem was the Salish people were old allies with the nearby Irendi, and the Irendi took a dim view on piracy. Infiltration proved to be near impossible for cultural reasons. The Etrugan language was one of the most complex in the world. Minrathad spies could only copy it with magic. Even then, the Salish customs were foreign to the Minrathadians, making impersonating them difficult. To the east, Veslan was coming into its own. Its warriors took on the Master while its merchants moved goods down the coast into new lands. With Ostlin and Solderfjord conquered, Veslan could move goods in more significant numbers. When Minrathad attempted to stop them through normal means, they found the regular spies were dwarfed by the massive Northmen in their home ports. The average Vestlander was almost a head taller than a human from the guilds. Only the dwarves had any success, and even then in small numbers. When Minrathad resorted to piracy, the Vestlanders responded with an open war on the seas. Minrathad's losses were small but costly. Vestlanders were very good at protecting their ships, and over 3 months, they had doubled their merchant fleet and captured vessels. Minrathad arranged a treaty to stop the conflict and moved on to its next plan. Guildmaster Meditor has started to find it challenging to do business with many mainland nations due to the changes in the national economics. Thyatis flooded the market with Etrugan gold a few years after the end of the Wizards' War. Darrican responded by converting as much gold into their certified letters of credit as possible. Many merchants have adopted the clocks for payment, refusing to do business in precious metals. Minrathad ships can convert their trade borrowers into clocks, but Darrican takes a cut. In response, Minrathad has started experimenting with its own paper currency, but they're playing catch-up to an economic power one step ahead of them. The situation of Minrathad isn't dire, but murmurs against Meditor are getting louder. The economic boom that Minrathad has enjoyed during the war has long since faded. The dirty tricks they used to push their merchandise have been thwarted through currency manipulation, cultural differences, increased anti-piracy actions, and the inability to speak Etrugan. Several guildmasters are quietly pushing for new leadership, and Meditor's spy network has been working overtime to remove threats as they appear, and the threats are appearing with far more regularity than ever. The Broken Lands are no more, except for a tiny sliver that used to contain the ogres. Most of the tribes were slaughtered on the fields of Favaro, thrown away by the Master as mere cannon fodder. The vaunted legions of Thar were torn apart by dwarven artillery, elven arrows, Karameikan knights, werebear savagery, and the gnomish carpet bombing didn't help. Most tribal leaders fell that day, with a handful of exceptions. Thar escaped from the battle and fled into the mountains of Rockholm. Eilbane and Queen Yazar abandoned the fight early, realizing their fate if they didn't. The Shadow Elves captured Hutai Khan during the battle, while Cole sought his fortunes in Glantry, which quickly ended up with him getting fed to werewolves. Ealbane and his ogres escaped the chaos by fleeing through the burning ruins of southern Darrican. He consulted his followers, who agreed their only hope of survival was to make themselves useful to someone. Those that disagreed were free to leave, but only a few did. While the allies were busy mopping up the Master's forces around Darrican City, the ogres managed to arrive at Athenos, where they offered to pay for transit to Thyatis. Ealbane had decided the ogres were going to be mercenaries, and Thyatis was the most understanding towards that. Rather than fight the ogres, the Darrican troops stationed in Athenos were more than happy to ship them off to another nation to be their problem. Thyatis jumped at the chance for the ogres to fight for them and used them in their conquest of the hinterlands. Ealbane died happily in his sleep 2 decades later from overindulgence. Hutai Khan's story was brief, as the Shadow Elves had to decide what to do with him. He was only alive because he knew how to find the lost city of Angmar deep in the world below. When the Shadow Elf Schism occurred, Khan found himself under the control of King Telamon. The king told the Hobgoblin he would be released after taking his forces to Angmar. Khan obeyed, and when the Elf King surveyed the legendary city, he released Khan, right into the lava below. Thar and Yazar entered the Makraz Mountains looking to link up with the humanoid tribes living above Rockholm. They didn't have to look far, as the humanoids were enjoying the dwarves being away to fight in the war. Thar had lost tens of thousands of troops, escaping with just a few hundred when he finally stopped running. He would need to replace those losses, and more, if he wanted to become a power player again. Rockholm was far more dangerous than the Broken Lands. The dwarves were used to fighting orcs with a long history of conflict with the humanoids, and they would soon be returning. Thar would need help. He decided to take a huge risk and cut a deal with the Modrigswerg. Thar had known about the Rot Dwarves for some time. At least he was familiar with the legends. They could craft anything as long as it was used for carnage and death, which was precisely what Thar had in mind. He told Yazar of his plans, who flat out told her leader it was a very bad idea. She kept telling him it was a very bad idea the entire journey into Solderfjord. He started to think that this was how her former husband felt before Clan Torquist's axes caught up with him. She nagged him all the way until they reached the Rot Dwarves' cave, when they finally stood aghast at the cursed smith's twisted form. Thar told the insane dwarf what he wanted, a weapon that would draw troops to him so he could conquer the world. The dwarf named his price, the soul of a powerful ally. Thar couldn't help but smile as Yazar screamed while her soul fueled the forge to construct his artifact. But he had what he wanted at last, the axe Worldbreaker, which no humanoid could look at and not feel the urge to follow its bearer. The mad dwarf's artifact worked all too well. Every tribe Thar came across bowed down to him. Soon his hundreds of warriors became thousands of warriors. He entered the Hardanger Mountains, knowing he could find over 1 million kobolds to join his growing army. The only problem? The gnomes beat him there. Thar could only watch in horror as the kobolds fled from their cave, running from the poison gas that bellowed out from them. The gnomes bombed the kobolds from above when they were out in the open. By the time the assault was over, 100,000 kobolds remained from a nation more than 10 times that size. But they were still enough for Thar's needs. Thar confronted the surviving kobolds, and over a week conscripted most of them into his army. He needed to feed them naturally, so he led them north into the human lands. Solderfjord was easily defensible because of its numerous bodies of water to the north and east, but Thar was coming from the south. It was too late when the humans realized they were being invaded. The refugees fleeing across the border didn't even raise much of an alarm, as Veslan and Yalarum thought it was just another Solderfjord civil war, and they would return once the fighting was done. Only when Thar conquered the capital did everyone realize how bad the situation was. The Solderfjordards had divided themselves by clans, and they died by clans. The lack of a central government condemned the nation to oblivion, though they fought hard and killed kobolds by the score. Thar earned himself a new kingdom, but would need to again replenish his forces before moving on to his next target. Darrican was still smoking months after the final battles were over. Huge portions of their newly renamed capital of Corwin was left in ruins. Half the nation had been burned, and everything west of the Striel River had fallen to the Master's forces. Umbarth and Tony houses, based around Lake Amsarag, were effectively destroyed when the Master sacked Axolai and Athenos, and taking most of their wealth. Corin Monty was dead, killed by Julian spears at the Second Battle of Darrican City. Most of the nation's wealth had been paid to mercenaries and foreign powers for their troops. It would be decades for the country to rebuild, but it had wisely planted the seeds of its rebirth years ago. Corwin Linton was the new chancellor, partially because of the wealth of Linton House, and partially because he was physically the closest to the surviving merchant house leaders when the war ended. At first he was honored to have the position. Then, when he learned the true devastation of the war, he was stunned. Entire cities would have to be rebuilt. The dead were in the hundreds of thousands. Usually an election would be held to determine the new chancellor, but the number of surviving councillors was still unknown, and there was no time for procedure now. Linton ordered that all indentured servants still working were under the state's control. He needed all the manpower he could get. Linton had the reputation of being a hard man. Usually this would make him an unpopular leader in Darrakan, but as luck would have it, he was now the perfect man for the job. Prisoners of war were pressed into work crews to repair roads, plant crops, and rebuild the villages they destroyed. Excess labor from Salonika and other eastern cities was moved to the west to repopulate the region. He made numerous decisions that went against everything Darrakan stood for, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He even spoke bluntly with Stefania Torion, sister of the Thaiatian emperor, to remind her how much Thaiatis owed Darrakan. His tone was mostly bluster, but he had to remind his debtors he hadn't forgotten their tabs. Slowly, Darrakan reclaimed lost territory. Great effort was made to restore the capital to its former glory. The old, half-burned merchant house was torn down, and the merchant prince wizards used magic to build the new one in a single day. New merchant houses were promoted to replace the lost ones, and goods from Vestland and Salishan were welcomed across the nation. With the shires recovering faster because of their agricultural focus and smaller size, Darrakan started getting food shipments before starvation took hold. As many goods as possible were sold to the Ethengar, with the gold going to pay for more repairs. Thaiatis' surprise invasion of the Tiger Clan was both a blessing and a curse for Darrakan. The destruction of the Tiger Clan meant money could be diverted elsewhere rather than defending the region. But in the span of a year, Thaiatis paid back its debts in full. It's quite sizable debts. Now Darrakan had more gold than it needed as Thaiatis went on a spending spree for Darrakan goods to celebrate. The gold poured in and started to saturate the economy. Inflation was taking hold. Something had to be done before the rebuild was stalled because of rising prices. Linton decided to fast-track Darrakan's transition to paper money. He set an exchange rate for coinage, and soon the merchant houses started buying up all the gold they could physically store. Transactions over a certain amount were restricted to paper currency only, forcing the merchants to switch to paper money even faster. There was tremendous pushback, but eventually the policy became accepted and precious metals stopped being used for common currencies. While Darrakan was reforming its coinage and restoring its destroyed cities, a shadow from its past emerged. Unknown patrons hired multiple powerful adventurers to investigate Castle Ithil and finally slay the evil contained within. A dozen went in, and that night sailors across Lake Amsarat could hear the sounds of battle echoing from the castle. The following day, 3 adventurers came out of the castle to announce the demon that had haunted it for centuries was no more. Castle Ithil was finally freed from its curse. Then their mysterious patrons revealed themselves to the public. The survivors of House Ithil finally came out of their self-exile. With the wealth contained in Castle Ithil's vault, the claimants had enough wealth to become the 4th largest house in Darrakan. They began their operations again from Akaros, sending luxury goods to Corwin and the surrounding cities, all the way to the lands beyond. They avoided questions about their missing years, only claiming they were victims of an attempted magical assassination that destroyed their house in one night. There were no records of what actually happened, only speculation and the word of House Ithil. Their descendants were well integrated into Darrakan society, having married into positions of power through the years. The merchant house seemed poised to again regain its lost strength. Corwin Linton served as chancellor for almost 2 decades before time finally caught up with him. He was old when he first took control of Darrakan and served his nation well, if not a bit sternly. Even when a vote was finally called to decide on a chancellor 2 years after the war, he won in a landslide. Still, the burden of leadership had taken its toll, and he finally passed away surrounded by family. A new chancellor was needed, and in a surprise vote, Stuart Ithil, the new head of his family, was elected by a large margin. Many are apprehensive about the intentions of this relative newcomer to Darrakan politics, but his natural charm is appeasing his critics for now. Moghlai Khan was possibly the strongest leader coming out of both wars. His surprise attack on the Master allowed his men to loot the Hulian baggage train in the aftermath of the Battle of Favaro. His troops had been complaining about the lack of victories that he had brought them, but in a single battle, they sang his praises long into the night. His nation became one of the wealthiest, though that was only mainly because of the other powerful nations being reduced to rubble. But one victory was not going to be enough for the Golden Khan. His armies were at full strength, but again his targets were limited. As much as he would love to raze Glantry to the ground, the bottlenecks that serve as the only access into that nation meant it was easily defendable. Darrakan had just been devastated. Horses were useless in the elven forests. Vestland was one mountain after another, followed by heavily forested hills before you got to the actual people. Helden was too spread out to be worthwhile. He decided to go into Windar, as the nation was remote enough to prevent allies from coming to its aid, but small enough to make the conquest feasible. The hordes of the Khan rolled into the Elven nation 2 years after Darrakan made peace with Hul. The initial assault took a quarter of the country before they could even respond. When the Windarian king went to meet his invaders on the field of battle, he brought the Elven Star, an artifact that greatly expanded the power of his spells. It had been used to destroy entire armies with a single fireball, and he expected the same to happen here. Except Ethengar doesn't play fair. When their army appeared, they were driving captured Windarian civilians before them. The king couldn't target the horse warriors without killing thousands of his own people. The good-hearted king hesitated, and the Ethengarians overran his position. Windar quickly fell, but the Khan left it a vassal state. He wasn't interested in personally ruling the tiny nation. He had grander plans. Though Moglai kept the Elven Star as a prize, he also let the king keep his throne as long as the tribute kept coming in. When the Windarian king learned that the Golden Khan was looking to carve out an empire, he was more than happy to show Moglai a map of the nation of Dinnegoth, Windar's most hated foe. The only viable route was a narrow pass through the northern mountains, but the forces of Dinnegoth lightly guarded it, as they didn't expect any active aggression from Windar. Past the mountains were extensive plains, with the desert holding their capital. The Khan agreed that this would be a worthy prize and ordered his men to head north, leaving a token force to garrison Windar. And the king was right. Dinnegoth was unprepared for an invasion of thousands of horse warriors. Getting through the pass required a battle with a blue dragon that was left as a guard, and while the battle was deadly, one dragon was no match for an entire invasion force. The Hawkaman brought by Moglai Khan proved the tipping point, finally laying the dragon low with magic. Dinnegoth's forces consisted of humanoids and human barbarians, and mostly infantry. When the Ethengar army reached the vast open plains, Dinnegoth was doomed. The Shadow Lord's armies were used to fighting troops on the defense, not a large horde of horse archers. One by one, the towns of Dinnegoth were surrounded and either surrendered or destroyed. Their first challenge was that of the Black Dragon Vitriol, who was more interested in protecting his territory than fighting the Ethengar. And rather than combat the dragon, the Khan offered it tribute and proceeded north. Landrin Teriak, the Shadow Lord of Dinnegoth, was not afraid of leading his men into combat. But the Ethengar's attacks left him searching for answers to the threat. His dragons couldn't stop the horde. One died in the process, and the other one was bribed into inactivity. The wizard finally decides to resort to trickery, inviting the Khan and a retinue to meet him and negotiate terms of surrender. Teriak greets the Khan and his guards and offers to serve as a vassal state in exchange for being left alone. The Shadow Lord of Dinnegoth offers the Golden Khan of Ethengar a large chest of coins to prove his loyalty and toasts his health. The Khan accepts the Shadow Lord's terms, drinks the toast, and keels over dead. Then the actual Moglai Khan steps forward from his bodyguard standing behind his now deceased food taster and orders his bodyguard to slaughter the Shadow Lord's servants, but take him alive. Moglai Khan might enjoy hearing his praises sung, but he was no fool. After a rather short but fierce battle, the Shadow Lord found himself held down by the Khan's men. Moglai Khan watched as his troops melted down the gold that was offered as tribute, and explained to the Shadow Lord exactly what he did wrong in the error of his ways. Moglai explained in great detail why it was unwise for the uppity leader of some backwater kingdom to anger the Golden Khan. Once he was done monologuing, he had his men pour the molten gold down the Shadow Lord's throat. The Khan's sight soon fell on Hool, as he was getting older and he would have to start on his quest for immortality soon. One more great conquest should cement his gift to the immortals. Hool, since the death of the Master, was a fragmented state, with various clerics carving out their own domains. The Ethengar would ride north from Windar, hitting the Hagiarchy from above, hopefully sweeping down and conquering the nation in a single push. At first it went as planned. The Ethengar conquered the states of Carson and Carcyle in days. The cleric ruling Bergadur capitulated almost immediately and swore allegiance to the Khan. But the Hoolian forces guarding the western section of the nation put aside their differences and fought as one. The Ethengarians pushed forward, but the fight was slowed with winter setting in and Hool sending everything they had against them. Now the Khan will wait another year to try and finish Hool while he attempts to find allies among the surrounding lands. Fortunately for him, the Hagiarchy has more enemies than allies. The Shadow Elves are the tale of two kingdoms, New Angmar on the surface and the City of Stars deep below ground. Queen Tanadalio rules New Angmar with a velvet glove, using all of her wits and wiles to ensure her people's prosperity. She brooks no competition because what is best for her is what's best for New Angmar. She plays politics better than Bargle plays What Have I Got in My Pocket. Her people love her, her rivals seethe impotently, and to the outside world, she's a mystery to be unraveled. In stark contrast, her father, King Telamon, is a broken man, or elf. His grudge against the surface elves cost him his throne, primarily due to his daughter's machinations. The number of elves that remained in the City of Stars have dropped from the tens of thousands to mere hundreds, as the surface has everything the Shadow Elves could have ever hoped for. These elves cling to their hatred of the surface. No amount of good news coming from New Angmar will change their mind. Telamon sits in an almost empty city plotting revenge on all those who have wronged him, from Alfheim to his own daughter, and the list keeps growing by the day. When the war ended, Tanadelia was in a difficult position. She had her new nation. She had the promise of friendship from half a dozen countries. She had the adoration of her people. What she didn't have was a functioning state. The elves had no infrastructure, no currency, no established relationships with any of the surrounding countries. The Shadow Elves went from lacking neighbors to sharing borders with Glantry, Effingar, and Darraken, with Alfheim just a stone's throw away. Darraken was pushing hard to help Angmar by taking over the building of their infrastructure, but Tanadelio knew that that would come with a price later. It always did. Darraken's rival in terms of economic help was Vestland. One of their generals had ascended to immortality during the war defending the elves, and the site of the battle was now holy ground for the Northmen. Rather than chase them out as her father would, the queen welcomed the humans and allowed them to establish a settlement. The Vestlanders even built a church for their new immortal, much to the consternation of Radiant Shaman Porphyriel. Shadow Elf warriors felt a bond with the Vestlanders, having fought numerous battles alongside them during the war. When Shadow Elves were found attending services at the shrine to the Northern Pantheon, the Temple of Raphael adamantly demanded its removal. Tanadelio refused because now she had leverage against the temple. She set up a trade for coins and goods for lumber. The trees of Angmar glowed with a magical aura in the forest, but if they were cut down and shipped across the border, the aura stopped, leaving you with strangely colored logs that, while perfectly good for construction, had no magical properties at all. Angmar wood was still highly sought after by wealthy nobles, but the initial craze they caused died down in a few years. This was after Glantry spent several large fortunes on all the wood the elves would ship. Tanadelio needed to open new markets for her people. Commonplace items were often luxuries for the Shadow Elves, and now that they were a part of the world economy, they couldn't get enough of things like glass, dyes, and all manner of food. Darraken was dealing with their shattered nation in the years after the war, so Vestland provided the majority of the initial trade goods. Merchants could cross Effingar with only minor issues, as the horsemen didn't see the point of raiding caravans loaded with nails and windows. The variety of trade goods that soon flooded New Angmar allowed the elves to cut loose from their normal state appearance. Shadow Elf homes were often garishly decorated. Walking past one of their neighborhoods was the equivalent of being assaulted by an angry crayon box. The big one, with the sharpener. There's no sense of uniformity. Houses will be painted in bright, clashing colors according to their owners' tastes. The Queen has found herself a celebrity in other nations. Some, like Glantry, want to use her in their political games. Moglai Khan is genuinely curious about her and her nation, preferring them to the humanoids they displaced. Darraken intends to eliminate the Vestland influence by providing all the support they can to the elves. King Harold of Vestland promises his people will be treated fairly in their new home. The Sylvan Elves of Alfheim are trying to keep an eye on their cousins, with distrust still running high. Other nations see the elves as either a threat or a potential ally, and they would like to know which one. Tanadelio loves playing political games. She has announced her desire to take up a consort and created a bit of a scandal by allowing herself to be openly courted by a Vestland chief instead of a Shadow Elf. That has become a show for her. She will frequently attend foreign functions with new eye candy on her arm. She's particularly fond of short bald men, as they're very grateful. But powerful Shadow Elves and other times local power players trying to ingratiate themselves to New Angmar will be her choice. She's a fixture at the Darraken masked balls and has been entertained as far away as Thyatus. Her people might still be wary of outsiders, but she's embraced her role as queen and all the attention it brings. The more people spend to buy her attention, the more wealth she provides for her people. King Telamon, on the other hand, never gets invited anywhere. He sits on his throne and broods over his lost power. All the shamans have left, leaving him complete control of a city that doesn't even have 5% of its original population. Entire neighborhoods sit vacant. Even the soulstone mines lie unworked. Not that it matters, the soulstones started to disappear with the creation of the Angmar forest. The other Shadow Elf cities have been abandoned, with all their remaining citizens moving to the City of Stars. He still wants to destroy Alfheim, but he won't be invading anyone with less than 1,000 followers. His daughter tried to placate him by turning over a prisoner of war who knew the way to the fabled lost city of Angmar. The prisoner wasn't lying. He led the king and a few of his followers to the lake of lava that the city floated on. The king now had a target he could actually conquer. He executed the prisoner before returning to tell his followers of his discovery. The city held thousands of humanoids, but they could be routed with the right spells and planning. Telamon started seeking knowledge to gain the upper hand in the coming battle. He found his answer in the former Temple of Raphael. The temple had been cleaned out, with all the texts and even the trappings relocated to the surface temple. But Telamon found a secret room that he never even suspected, and on the walls of the room of the deepest part of the temple was the 15th verse of the Refuge of Stone, the one telling the secret of the Soul Stones. Telamon had been lied to. The spirit shamans had deceived him, deceived his people. the same people that turned their back on him. That night he recanted his loyalty to Raphael, to the temple, and swore to retake his rightful place as the head of the Shadow Elves, tearing his traitorous daughter from her throne. He dreamed of a feathered serpent that night, one that promised to give him everything he needed as long as he obeyed. As a gift, the king would be given the city of Angmar as his throne while he plotted his revenge. The next day, a poison mist choked the lost city once more. The day after, Talamon claimed it as his own. The 5 clans of Etrugin have been going their own ways for a while. The differences between the cultures of its people have already divided them internally. The Tiger clan turned to the worship of entropic immortals and split from their kin centuries ago. The Turtle clan was isolated from the 3 remaining by the Great Plateau and had more contact with foreign nations than their own people. The Horse clan never wanted to be on the plateau and searched for a way to return to the lowlands. The Bear clan preferred the old ways, but trade with the outside world had begun to change their attitudes. Only the Elk remained true to their culture, and they demanded the other clans do so as well, often leading to conflict. The War of the Master drove these divisions even deeper. The war negatively affected most of the tribes. The Tiger clan allied themselves with the Master and sent thousands of their braves to attack the cities of Darrakan and the Shires. The Turtle clan avoided the worst of the war because of the protection from the nearby Fey Court. The Horse clan finally left the plateau and found themselves in an artificial winter that hampered their initial plans. Thar's legion attacked the Elk and Bear clans when a good number of the humanoids scaled the cliff to attack the softer targets on top of it. When the war was over, Etrugin was thrust into the public spotlight because of the actions of its shamani in the creation of New Angmar. It was difficult to go back to the old ways now, whether they wanted to or not. They were now members of the international community. Besides, the Horse clan had stolen most of the bison when they escaped. The long winter was devastating for most clans, not just in losing crops, but they were not used to dealing with the heavy snow. The largely nomadic Horse clan had few permanent structures and were forced to shelter in place from the blowing snow on the worst days. Starvation became a significant threat to smaller tribes as they didn't have food stores that could last almost a year without new crops. The Elk clan was able to send out relief shipments to towns that were in danger of running out of food, but shipments to the Bear and Horse tribes always came with stipulations. Worse, the humanoids on the plateau were starving as well, so defending the convoys was always a priority, and success was never guaranteed. Tensions between the 3 tribes on the plateau grew more strained due to the war and the weather. The Elk and Bear both claimed that the Horse braves were driving the bison away from the traditional grazing lands and into lands considered horse territory. The Elk despised outsiders, at least the tribal leaders did, and the war not only brought humanoids into their lands, but visitors from other nations were an uncommon sight thanks to the Bear clan's partnership with Darrakan. The Thyatian conquest of the Tiger lands put them directly at the base of the plateau, and the Elk knew they couldn't defeat a professional army of that size if they could figure out how to scale the walls. The cracks started to appear before the war, but in the years following, long-held rivalries, disputes, and grudges split the clans apart, and even began pushing the tribes in different directions. Some clans could handle the changing future of the Etrugin people, but others couldn't adjust, and their people suffered for it. When all was said and done, the Etrugin clans looked nothing like they had in the past. The Tiger clan had left the Confederacy long ago, having turned away from the worship of Etrugin and instead embracing the teachings of Azanthiotl and their patron immortal Danal Tiger Stripes. Being trapped at the plateau's base only left them enraged because they couldn't strike at their most hated foes. Azanthiotl demanded sacrifices, and their poor location left them with few targets. The clan was already starting to fracture because of its 3 leaders, each seeking their own goals. When the Master of Hul's emissaries promised the clan, or more specifically their leaders, wealth and slaves if they would join the war against Darrakan and their allies, it wasn't a tough decision. The Tiger warriors were initially hesitant to get on the Hulian ships. They were not a nautical people. But after some convincing and threatening from the priesthood, the Tiger braves were soon raiding up and down the coast of the 5 shires. Initially, the war went well for them. They were able to overrun entire Hin villages, with the shire folk unaccustomed to the savagery of Azanthiotl's warriors. The troops were broken up into forces only a few hundred in size and allowed to attack in every direction, preventing the enemy from predicting their movements. Sacrifices poured into the forest of death almost daily, and the priests of the Viper and Tiger claimed that this was proof of the immortal's blessings. But then the snow of the long winter started, and the Tiger clan warriors, accustomed to fighting in a jungle, weren't prepared for the cold and the snow the destruction of the great meteor brought. They froze by the score. The Tiger's bane came from across the ocean when the weather finally broke. The Irindi joined the war, with their superior navy crushing the Hulian fleet. The small-scale tactics the Tiger clan used to great effort were countered when they faced the entire armies of Irindi, Karameikos, and Darrakan. They were raiders, not a full-blown military. When the enemy's reinforcements arrived, it showed on the field of battle. Of the 100,000 Tiger braves sent abroad, less than 20% returned. The Tiger rulers blamed each other. The Viper priest Talotaxel pushed for the war, inspired by visions from the immortal Azanthiotl. He was the true power behind the Tiger clan, even if he had to manipulate the others to get what he wanted. The tiger priest Tilil was a fat, greedy man who was instantly swayed by the tribute offered by the master's delegates. He was utterly useless as a leader, but was a figurehead for his people. Chief Zultekahulti was the official leader of the clan, but he was essentially powerless. When they were defeated, they immediately started scheming against each other to blame their rivals for the defeat and seize total power for themselves. This bickering paralyzed their government for over a year. Then the Thaiatians arrived. The invading legion wasn't a standard army. The troops were trained to fight in skirmish formation. This allowed them to fight the Tiger Braves on equal terms. Normally the Braves would have routed the Thaiatians with just sheer numbers, but the clan hadn't recovered even a quarter of its losses since the war. The infighting between the leaders cost them precious time to regain their strength, and now they were losing one city after another. When 3 additional legions arrived, the Tiger clan was doomed. They had squandered their military through ill-advised tactics and poor planning. Only the city of Makuixcoatl was spared. Its leader had long lost her faith in the clan's government because of mismanagement. She surrendered her city to the Darrican garrison at Port Tinabar. Now she rules a free city under the watchful eye of a Darrican legion. The capital braced itself for a siege and still fell within a week. Tlatoxel fled the city before the legions arrived. Rather than wait for relief, Zultekahulti rode out with the bulk of his forces and was captured in a lopsided battle. As the Thaiatian troops swarmed into the city, Tilil tried to bribe his way out, only to be thrown down the steps of the Great Pyramid by the now freed slaves. Zultekahulti was taken back to Thaiata City in chains while the Thaiatian commander set up his new command in the former capital of Kuan Mitsli. The Tiger clan had fallen, though the Thaiatians didn't bother to take control of anything outside the cities. But High Priest Tlatoxel wasn't done yet. He was still trying to finish the mouth of Azcan, a giant pit leading to the Hollow World and the hundreds of thousands of Azcan warriors waiting on the other end. The mouth was deep in the Forest of Death, where the Thaiatians didn't bother patrolling. He worked the slaves as fast as he could, as the completion of the project was still years away, and was not even proceeding at half speed now. When slaves died, he sent his few remaining troops to acquire more, but not to alert the occupiers of their presence. In the Hollow World, work continued with the workers there, but without the Tiger clan's steel tools, the Azcans were just as hampered. 10 years after the conquest of the Tiger clan, the Thaiatians finally tracked a raiding party back to the mouth. The fight was fierce but brief. Tlatoxel never stood a chance, and he knew it. Rather than being taken prisoner, he sacrificed himself by leaping into the mouth. Surviving Tiger priests claimed the project was a mine, but the Thaiatians saw no gold in the mouth, so they moved the workers to the gold mines in other parts of the nation. The Azcans still dig up towards the surface. When their half of the mouth of Azcan reaches the Tiger clan's half, the Thaiatians and the rest of the surface will have to deal with the countless Azcan warriors. At the rate they're going, this should be in about 5 years. The fall of the Bear clan was much more insidious and entirely self-inflicted. The war with the Master knocked the Great Elevator out of action, but repairing it wasn't difficult. Darrican had a supply of replacement parts, and the horses and oxen stolen by the orcs were quickly replaced. This reopened trade with the lowlands almost as soon as the war ended. But with the return of the merchants came the return of the problems. The wealth that flooded the Bear clan slowed down considerably, but it still arrived on time, just in smaller caravans. But like before the war, the wealth was not evenly divided between the tribes. Chief Rockhopper never understood how to handle his people's new wealth. The grifters and thieves smuggling goods into Darrican or other lands grew bolder in his indecisiveness. Soon, unscrupulous types from the lowlands that coveted Bear Clan goods but didn't want to give Darrican a cut were in direct contact with the Bear Clan thieves that were more than happy to smuggle in the black market trade goods. Worse, these criminals abandoned the old ways, as illegal goods were always more profitable than simple foodstuffs or clothes. Eventually, the black market was a decent percentage of all goods entering the Bear Clan cities. The poorer tribes were located the furthest from the Great Elevator. As the men of coin built new roads from the trading post to the Etrugan cities, they bypassed the smaller cities because it wasn't profitable. This led to the more affluent tribes ignoring their poorer cousins, favoring the merchant caravans. Worse, the wealthier clans started to adopt the ways of Darrican and other merchants, leading to the breaking of numerous taboos. This enraged the poorer tribes, who demanded Chief Rockhopper do something about the lawbreakers. The chief tried to appease both sides, but he still favored the larger cities as he didn't want to offend the merchants that were bringing in the goods, even if the goods were being hoarded by the more prominent tribes or stolen by the smugglers. Finally, the clan shattered. The merchants were bringing in metal goods in direct violations of Etrugan law. Worse, the more prominent tribes dropped all pretense of following the old ways and accepted the jewelry, tools, and weapon as status symbols. As much as Etrugan goods were in vogue in Darrican, a steel plow was the sign of a genuinely wealthy Etrugan farmer. Braves from the smaller tribes started ambushing the caravans as they moved from the world elevator to other towns. At first, bloodshed was avoided, but eventually open conflict broke out. Rockhopper tried to keep the peace, but it was too late. His poor leadership led to the clan splitting into traditionalists and modernists. The factions refused to acknowledge each other and effectively became two different clans. This left the Bear Clan without a leader, as Rockhopper, when he realized the extent of his failure, walked off the plateau. The Horse Clan never wanted to be on the Great Plateau to begin with. They followed the teachings of Stormtamer over Etrugan, as their patron was the first of their kind to ascend. They were warriors before the Raising, and spent centuries without an enemy to war against. Attacking other clans outside of the Tiger was forbidden, besides the Turtle Clan was in the lowlands, and the other two clans offered little to the Horse Clan outside of practice. The fortuitous discovery of a purple worm tunnel was their best chance to escape their gilded prison, and the Master's War was their best opportunity. After using a Glantrian wizard to expand and stabilize the tunnel, their braves carefully started herding the bison their clan depended on into their territory. All the clans on the plateau needed the bison, but the Horse Clan's culture centered on them. The loss of the herds would be devastating to the elk and bear, but it was a small price for the horse. When the long winter hit, the bison began to forage through the deep snow looking for food. Then Chief Nakona decided it was time for the Horse Clan to take their place on the lowlands before the other clans started hunting the bison out of season. The Horse Clan had practiced the transit through the cave they called the Sosian repeatedly. The clan was ready. They had a year's worth of food packed and ready on their workhorses. The bison would be tricky. There were tens of thousands of them, and driving the stubborn beasts through the miles-long tunnel would be difficult. If they stampeded, they would crush themselves to death. If the clan took too long, the elk and bear might discover their plan. But the braves and scout in charge of moving the herd had practiced on horses dozens of times. They had at least some training. In a process that took the better part of a day, the clan relocated over 50,000 bison and their entire clan to their new home, formerly the Nagpuri Game Reserve of Sind. Their disappearance shocked the two remaining clans, though the bear had its own problems to deal with, and there was nothing the elk could do except curse their cousins. The arrival of the Horse Clan impacted the course of the war once the snow had receded. They were looking for a fight, and their immediate neighbors were a large tribe of pachydermians that held little for the horse braves to raid, and worse, were more than capable of dismounting a warrior with a bone-shattering force in a single swipe. The Horse Clan agreed to practice ceremonial combat with their new neighbors, something the Elephant Men reluctantly agreed to. But once the snow melted, the braves tore into the rear guard of the Julian forces near Akasole and the plains of Sind as well. They quickly made a name for themselves as the clan joined forces with the allies. Not out of any loyalty, but that was the fastest way to gain glory in combat. Over the next 2 decades, the Horse Clan proved themselves difficult neighbors. They loved to fight, raid, and steal, but they could be placated with tribute. Their attacks are rare against arrogant cities. The Horse Clan respects their eastern neighbors' love of the pike and crossbow. The remnants of Sind are their preferred target, as the Nagpuri province was prosperous before the Master arrived, and many of the wealthiest Sindhi relocated there when their revolution occurred. However, their favorite target is their ancient enemies, the Red Orcs occupying the western hills. They will go out of their way to attack the humanoids, as there is more glory in collecting orc scalps than merely raiding a homestead. The Horse Clan's new territory is just called home by the former Etrugans, but other nations call them the Godan, the Sind word for horse people. Chief Nakona has stepped aside recently, happy to watch his grandchildren grow up. His hand-picked successor, Jakan, has taken up the mantle of leadership. Other nations have mixed feelings about the Godan. They will happily trade goods and even hire out for a fight, and no one in the region is better at fighting humanoids. But their use of raiding for coming-of-age rituals keeps relations strained, even if the Godans avoid permanent harm to their targets. The Elk clan before the war was the most powerful of all the clans. After the war, as the Horse abandoned the plateau and the Bear clan disintegrated through poor leadership, the Elk clan remained the only organized clan staying on the top. The Turtle clan had abandoned the old ways entirely, but had little contact with the Elk. The Tiger clan was obliterated, but had long since turned to entropy. This should have left the Elk in a position of strength, but a long-lingering internal division was about to change the clan forever. The Elk did play a small part in the War of the Master. With the humanoids rampaging almost unchecked across the plateau, the Elk sent several of their shamani to beseech the lowlanders for assistance. A handful of the Elk shamani were part of the ritual that resulted in the creation of New Angmar, even if they immediately returned after the war. Chief Degataga Tallcorn was enraged when the Horse clan went their own way, but there was nothing he could do about it. He was angry over what he considered the theft of all the bison more than the Horse clan's treachery. When the Bear clan splintered over the foreign trade, he sided with the traditionalists, doubling down on stopping merchants outside the Bear clan's territory. Under his guidance, the shamani reinforced the old ways, making sure that every tenet of their faith was obeyed. Despite Tallcorn's aid, his acceptance of the Bear clan traditionalists only went so far. They were not of his people, and had different customs despite sharing the same faith. He helped them when it served his purpose, primarily to anger the modernist Bear clan members. But even when asked to join by the smaller cities, the chief's answer was always no. The Elk clan helped its people first, and aid to outsiders, even other Etrugan, was only offered with stipulations. Eventually this attitude started being applied to the other Elk tribes. But not everybody was happy with this new power structure. The Owl tribe was home to the wizards of their clan, and while distrusted and feared by the other tribes, kept with the old ways. The Etrugan were taught to fear arcane magic, but Etrugan himself was known to have studied it. An obscure clause in the laws of the Confederation allowed for arcane magic to be studied, but only from the teachings of their patron immortal. The tribal chief, Unaduti Skunkhair, is intelligent and wise and understands the laws of the old ways better than most shamani. The fact that he's a powerful diviner prevents the more radical members of his clan from surprising the tribe with an unannounced inspection. His divination powers also told him that the clan's current course of action would end in tragedy if left unchecked. Tall Corn was reaching old age when the war ended, and he started looking for his heir. Both of his children had taken up the role of shamani, which means they were ineligible to become the clan chief. His favorite candidate was Galalani Fasthorse, a brave who had earned his respect through her almost religious attacks on foreign caravans. Her chief rival was Kanuna Stonemaker, the chief of the Beaver tribe. He was a forward-thinking man, building his version of the Great Elevator, but on the southern edge of the plateau, allowing the Elk to have contact with the Turtle clan. He was popular, but focused on civil projects rather than enforcing the old ways. Tall Corn called a meeting of the tribal leaders to discuss his successor. He'd already decided on Fasthorse, but the tribe still needed to vote. His voice would carry much favor, and he considered it a formality. But Stonemaker made a strong case for himself. He was about to finish his construction, and the Elk clan could join the world stage on their terms. Fasthorse accused the chief of blasphemy, and in a move that shocked everyone, produced a blade and tried to stab the Beaver tribe leader. Well, everybody except Skunkhair, who saw it coming. He interposed himself between the two candidates, but he had to vaporize her with magic in self-defense when Fasthorse threatened him with the knife. Tallcorn was shocked by what happened and said nothing when Stonemaker was named chief. He taught Fasthorse that those who abandoned the old ways needed to be brought to heel, but he never thought she would try to harm her people. The Turtle clan are Etrugan no longer. After being separated from their kin for centuries, they turned to neighboring countries for trade and assistance. They bordered Sin and were less than 100 miles away from Irindi, compared to not only being cut off from the plateau by massive walls, but even if they scaled them, the nearest Elk city was leagues away. Eventually they started abandoning the old ways for a more pragmatic approach. After the war, the Turtle clan found itself largely unscathed. The Master's forces tried 2 assaults, only to find the clan well protected by the Nunahei, an allied Fey court found where the Singing Forest and Forest of Death met. Their merchants were beginning to make headway in the ports of other nations, and with Darrican's caravans reduced in numbers and Minrithad gouging everyone they could, Turtle merchant ships were greeted as far away as Thyatis. This expansion of their market had unexpected consequences they could have never predicted. Thyatis was looking for new territories to expand into, and while still spent from the war, was a formidable enemy. Using information garnered from Turtle clan sources, Thyatis invaded the depleted Tiger clan and conquered it within a year. While Thyatis was friendly to the Turtle clan, even having established an embassy, the clan was very uncomfortable with an expansionistic neighbor who had eyes for more. By this time, the Horse clan was gone, and the Bear clan was fighting amongst itself. The Elk clan only helped people on their terms, despite what the old ways said. Chief Tai Goldhands spent an entire week consulting with his closest advisors. When he came out of the council, the Turtle clan was no more. The old ways were no more. The nation of Salashar was born. Salashar was the Etrugan name for the Sea People. The Salashites would stand independently without relying on ancient agreements with distant kin who were both unable and unwilling to come to their aid. Chief Goldhands first made a treaty with the nation of Irindi, already an old friend of his clan. If Thyatis wished to invade, it would have to be done by land because of Irindi's terrifying fleet. But attacking by land would risk the wrath of the Fey folk, again a thought that would have Phaeacian tacticians lying awake. But Emperor Eusebius had other plans for his armies and recognized the new nation within a few weeks. Salashar is the newest country on the international stage. They're allied with the provisional government of Sind, though the city of Kandraputra did have loyalties to the old Raja. Their merchants have proven quite adept at foreign commerce and are starting to catch up to the mercantile powerhouses of Darrican and Minrithad. They had a significant head start after the war, but their progress is slowing after Darrican's economy started ramping up. Goldhands is looking for a replacement in his golden years. He is almost a legendary figure in his clan. He has accommodated his people that still kept with the old ways, while encouraging new customs for those wanting to discard the crueler aspects. He banned slavery and stopped exiling orphans, a barbaric practice he was never comfortable with. The next chief will require approval from the tribes, but at this point, Anyone Goldhand suggests will likely be accepted without question. The story of Thyatis starts with Emperor Eusebius. With the assassination of his father, he found himself the new emperor, and to make matters worse, he was in the middle of a war with his nation's most hated foe. Still, his first day on the job could have gone much worse. If he hadn't been extra vigilant, the Alphatian assassins might have also claimed him that dark day. But Eusebius was prepared not just for potential threats, but to ascend to the throne. Unfortunately for Alphatia, he was well prepared. The Empire weathered the War of the Wizards relatively intact physically, though the nation was devastated in what ended as a stalemate. The Alphatians had landed on the Phaeacian mainland in multiple locations, and there wasn't a province in all of the Isle of Dawn that wasn't ravaged by war. Worse still, the war nearly bankrupted the Empire. Men that should have been farming, sailing, or building towns had been pressed into service. All the available taxes went into the war effort. Usually the reduction in food production would have been mitigated by buying grain from Darachin or the Five Shires. The problem was, first, they were on fire thanks to the Master, and then the grains were frozen under 6 feet of snow in the middle of summer thanks to the great meteor that exploded miles over Lake Ithel. There wouldn't be any easy access for food for Thyatis when it needed it the most. The coffers were empty, the granaries were dry. The senators were screaming for Eusebius's head when he made peace with Alphatia. Eusebius answered his critics in his trademark curt fashion. Steps were being taken to acquire more food and wealth to restore Thyatis to its pre-war glory. The senators that kept screaming learned Eusebius' second trait, his absolute ruthlessness towards people that annoyed him. He put his more vocal critics up on conspiracy charges to kill his father, Eusebius' favorite accusation. A few show trials and gladiatorial executions later, no one accused the emperor of incompetence. At least not out loud. But the critics were right, and worse, he knew it. Silencing them kept the population from rioting, but he needed to fix the shortages quickly. He takes his sister Stephania into his confidence. She has the charm and intelligence to serve as his voice in political matters requiring a degree of tact. Eusebius might be knowledgeable for a leader, but he's got the charm of a stone golem and relies on his advisors to guide him to the right decisions. Fortunately for him, where he lacks warmth, his sister compliments him. Stephania has no inspiration for the throne, but her brother follows her advice more than anyone else. Together they start to drag Thyatis back from the brink. Stephania is sent on a public relations tour to try and undo some of the damage Thyatis did by turning its back on the rest of the world. She does this with the full support of her brother. Whatever she decides is now Phaeacian law. Her first stop is in Karameikos, where she congratulates King Stephen on his coronation, apologizes for her father's refusal to come to his help, and pledges Phaeacian support for defense. She does this without asking for anything in return, and they both know it's to prevent a disruption in trade. She then heads to Darachin to see precisely how bad the war left them, only to find the tales of devastation were understated. 2 of the great houses had been obliterated in the war. Corwin Linton, the new chancellor, hasn't even finished counting the dead to give Stephania an honest answer about when Darachin will be back on its feet. Eusebius reads Isitra's report with great interest. Few nations could help Thyatis, given the state of the world. His nation's reputation for treachery didn't help relations at all. Thyatis was already in serious debt to Darachin, and they would call on those loans soon. Ethengar was now quite wealthy, but too distant to help. Karameikos was sending most of its aid to Darachin and the Shires. Yalarim still held lingering grudges against Thyatis for their occupation centuries ago. The only nation that was sending goods in sufficient numbers was Vestland, but even they couldn't keep up with demand. His first step to alleviate supply issues was to stand down several legions and send the soldiers home. It might have been too late to help with this year's harvest, but he gave them plenty of time to plant for next season. It also cut the cost of the military by a third, as Thyatis went from 30 legions to 20 with just the stroke of a pen. The more experienced soldiers were transferred to the more established legions. Most of the legions removed were the reserves that built roads in the empire itself. To try to increase the food supply and end the conflict that had been largely ignored during the war with Alphatia, Thyatis more than tripled the number of legions fighting in the hinterlands. The tribesmen were barely holding their own against 3 legions. They now faced 10 battle-scarred armies fresh from the war with Alphatia. Being able to concentrate on the lands to the south saw the clans fall in short order. Rather than taking slaves and marching prisoners to Thyatis city for display, the emperor showed mercy. By mercy, he meant everybody was working on a farm and the grain was going on boats headed north. This helped Thyatis in the years directly after the war. The nation still teetered on bankruptcy and huge sections were devastated, but they avoided food riots. The more veteran legions were pulled back from the hinterlands to help rebuild, and Stephania's goodwill tour continued. Eusebius thought about seizing wealth from the richer nobles that he despised, but their combined wealth was a drop in the bucket compared to what Thyatis owed its creditors. The only way to pay the military, Darachin, and to afford the nation's governmental agencies was to increase the nation's income. Higher taxes were counterproductive. That dried up future income. Another source needed to be found. Stephania was doing her best finding new trading partners for Thyatis. Minarthad was still pissy over that whole invasion of a contested island and was charging a mint for their goods. Vestland was happy to send merchant ships to Thyatis, but they didn't have the volume needed to impact the economy significantly. She scored a major moral victory by convincing Oceansend, her father's homeland, to return to the influence of Theatis. King Yarvik knew which way the winds were blowing. Alphatia had turned inward to deal with their problems. Theatis was looking to expand. Stefania approached him cordially and gave him excellent terms to rejoin Theatis. Yarvik knew her brother would not be so generous and accepted her terms. Back at home, Eusebius was reading reports from the War of the Master, and he was often obsessed with the lands of the West and what they could bring to Theatis. He paused as he read descriptions of the Tiger clan prisoners taken by the Karameikos army, and how even the lowliest warrior had some gold jewelry on them. Etrugan was mainly unknown to Theatis. The only mentions in imperial records reported that almost all of them lived on a giant cliff, impractical to attack. Nobody ever went into the dense jungle that housed the Tiger clans. Phaeacian cartographers in those days had a lousy reputation for laziness, and just making up names and descriptions for the regions they didn't want to explore properly. A Phaeacian observation post was hidden away on the Etrugan Roaring Surf Island, but it was poorly positioned to spy on the Tiger clan. All the notes they had was the tribe was notoriously poor sailors. The Emperor called for the Darrican ambassador and asked the man in depth about their dealings with the Tiger clan raids. The ambassador explained that they were a nuisance, but a deadly one. 2 forts on their border countered their attacks, but they were also considered a danger to Port Tinabar. He stated their frequent target was their cousins to the west, the Turtle clan, now known as the Nation of Salishan. He told the Emperor that they would be the best source for information on their bloodthirsty kin. Fortunately, Salish ships were becoming a common sight in Theatis City's docks, and as luck would have it, there were 4 of them in port. Eusebius ordered the ship's officers brought to him the following evening under the guise of establishing formal relations with the tiny nation. He even ordered a banquet prepared, complete with entertainment and gifts. The governments had established formal ties, which were handled by low-ranking bureaucrats. A small nation sandwiched between more prominent, powerful countries was of little interest to Eusebius until now. The wine flowed, and Eusebius did his best to entertain the Etrugan, though he wisely left the talking to his more charismatic underlings. The captains described their people in detail, their history, and the changes that were going on with their lands. Eusebius brought up the Tiger clan when his guests failed to mention them, and he was warned they were a militant people who attacked anyone near them. The captains took turns telling horror stories about the Tiger clan before the subject was changed to a lighter topic, but Eusebius had his knowledge. For a month he pored over every piece of information he could find about the Tiger clan. He read after-battle reports from the War of the Master, from Darrican, 5 Shires, and Karameikos sources. The Tiger clans were merciless in battle, each one a veteran warrior. But the reports also mentioned that they took horrific losses as they preferred to fight to the death. The Emperor consulted sages, scholars, and even druids about the Forest of Death. Phaeacian legions were at a disadvantage in rough terrain. It went counter to their closed ranks tactics. He needed warriors trained to fight independently. He required the Hinterlanders. General Klaus Hauptesberg, a Haitian commander of the 13th Legion, was tasked with taking a single Raven tribe auxiliary legion and reconnoitering the Forest of Death by force. He was to return to Theatis with his findings, and a decision would be made on a second expedition. Many thought the expedition was suicide, but the Hattaian viewed it as an opportunity for advancement. 2 months later, the Phaeacian invasion of the Tiger clan began. The Cougar tribe of Etrugan was known for using boats to raid small villages. They weren't the largest tribe in the Tiger clan, but they had plenty of warriors. But they were unprepared for thousands of screaming gigantic tattooed warriors that landed from the sea. Halftig-Sveg initially tried to keep his men in some formation, but when he realized the Etrugans were intimidated by the larger Hinterlanders, he ordered a full-on charge. The battle was brief, as much of the Cougar tribe fled the field when the Phaeacian charge hit. He allowed his men to sack the city as reward for their first victory, and noticed the town had a massive amount of gold. It was everywhere, from decorations to jewelry to mundane uses like dishes. In the following weeks, the Hinterlanders pushed inward, fighting the Tiger clan in their native environment, the dense jungles. Phaeacian losses were tolerable, but starting to mount. They reached the vampire tribe next, and despite the city's impressive fortifications, they found it undermanned. A brief siege broke the defenders, and again the town was found to have large amounts of gold. Halftig-Sveg was confused by the defense the Tiger clan was putting up. The numbers they expected just weren't there. He accounted for the numerous warriors they fought in the jungle, but they should be facing armies of equal size at least. He expected a trap at some point, but after they took the 3rd city with only moderate resistance, he concluded that the Tiger clan had spent most of its forces in the war. Their losses in Darrican were the majority of its army. The general needed more men to finish his conquest, but he needed to raise them from the Hinterlanders. The Emperor was right, the dense jungles would be impassable, but just conscripting Hinterlanders would get him rebellious troops. Then he had an idea. He called his troops together and announced they would fortify their position while waiting for reinforcements. But as a reward for bravery and victory, he was sending 200 men back with full honors and as much gold as they could carry. He picked the largest of his men, and they could carry the most gold. He then had mages send his plans to the Emperor and how gold-rich the Tiger clan was. The Hinterlanders saw their returning men's wealth and flocked to join the battle. The general lost 200 men in his gambit and received 30,000 fresh troops in return in a matter of months. The Emperor then sent an entire legion, complete with engineers, to help pave the roads to make it easier for the gold to reach their ships. Haltigsveg had his men, and within the year he took the rest of the Tiger clan, save a single city that appealed to Derikin for mercy. Eusebius could only stare in disbelief at the mountain of gold dumped in his throne room by his servants. The looted religious items from just the Viper Temple nearly reached the ceiling. Along with the gold was a request from General Haltigsveg for a triumph honoring his conquest. Eusebius could only answer with a nod, the treasure pile so enraptured him. While the general was getting the largest parade since the coronation of Fincall, complete with the Tiger clan chief escorted as a prisoner on display, Theodas was sending every man they could to mine the Tiger gold. Theodas had already sent every Tiger clan prisoner they had to work the mines, even repurposing the slaves of the Tiger clan to mine for them, only with slightly better living conditions. Within a year of the debt to Derikin had been paid in full. In 2 years, Theodas' economy had fully recovered. Still, Eusebius wanted more. Diplomatically, Theodas was having a renaissance. Full diplomatic relations with Alphatia were established, with Prince Tridorian being named the ambassador to Theodas. The Alphatians expected Eusebius to appoint his youngest sister, Australia, as an ambassador to Alphatia in return. But he felt she was a poor fit for such an important position and sent her to Salishan, naming a more experienced diplomat to Alphatia instead. Stephania made several promises to smaller nations to protect them if they were attacked by a larger, more powerful nation, including numerous city-states. When the Alphatian civil war started between the different claimants to the throne, Eusebius protected Tridorian from his half-brother. They even sent a fleet to retaliate against Prince Xandor before the king of Osland ended the conflict peacefully. As a reward for the king's bravery, and since Osland no longer served its original purpose, Eusebius allowed the nation to revert to independence. Stephania's diplomacy paid off almost immediately for Theodas when the Black Raja of Jubul attempted a coup in the city-state of Slagovich. It gave Theodas a reason to invade. Jubul was not a populous nation with only 2 large cities. When the legion from Tel Akbar landed, the fight was brief but bloody. The Black Raja was captured and returned to Theodas city, while his nation was garrisoned and became a puppet state. Usually Alphatia would be outraged because of the proximity to Sin, but they were busy killing each other while Xandor and his niece Arafne discussed who got the throne. Alphatia had withdrawn most of their troops from the region, so their promise to protect Sin was worthless. Eusebius, meanwhile, added another province to the empire. The greatest achievement for Eusebius came 20 years into his reign, with the discovery by an adventurer of a floating city found deep in the ethereal plane. A cleric of Vanya named Antigone Hellenicus came across the Radiant Citadel while she was searching for a lost elven artifact. The city prided itself on its open-mindedness, diversity, and benevolent nature. Hellenicus, a good Thaiatian, couldn't help but notice how defenseless the city was. Through conversations with some natives, she learned that the city couldn't activate its defenses unless all 12 of the ruling council, called the Speakers, agreed unanimously to activate them, but only if they were in a specific location. They had no army, just a standing guard backed by a few dozen powerful adventurers. Many buildings were made completely of gemstone, and the government hoarded wealth with high taxes and tariffs. Anyone successful would be punished in the name of equality to benefit the less fortunate. Hellenicus believed that somebody in a system this inefficient would not be content with the status quo. She didn't have to look far. The leader of a group of people from a land called Ianido met with Hellenicus privately. The speaker Kan Wu was tired of a government where one speaker could lock down the city until their demands were met. Innovation was stifled by the government, punishing those that would try to better themselves, so the city stagnated. If the Ianido people were given a land to call their own and allowed to rule it themselves, they would do what they could to prevent the activation of the city's defenses. Theodas would still have to get through the city's formidable magic forces, including an ancient dragon, but they would at least reach the city. Kanwu gave Hellenicus several gems common to the city as proof of her devotion to their plan. The cleric returned to Theodas to provide the emperor with Kanwu's machinations. Emperor Eusebius' reaction to Hellenicus' description of a poorly defended city filled with magic, gems, and great wealth, just waiting to be conquered by a military force of any decent size, was not what she had hoped for.
You must think that I'm some kind of moron to believe a story like that.
Still, she persisted, and being a loyal Thaiatian, already had half a dozen plans to exploit the citadel's weaknesses. The problem was the large number of wizards guarding the city. Theodas was highly experienced in fighting wizards, but many could cause a problem, especially motivated ones, unlike the Alphatian archmages. Stephania proposed a plan that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. They should ask the Alphatians for help. Theodas was officially a backer of Glantry, but Eusebius didn't trust the wizard princes further than he could throw a purple worm. Empress Arafne was settling into her position as ruler and owed Eusebius for saving her father's life during the Civil War. Stephania set out the plan. Alphatia would supply its largest airship, at least 50 reliable wizards of great power, and as many constructs as they could spare. Theodas would provide elements of the Retibius air fleet and send the Legionis Secundus, the most veteran legion in all of Theodas. Then the airship would dock at the Radiant Citadel, disgorge the troops, and take control of the city. The two empires would then split the loot as decided by the commander of the two forces, with a neutral third party in the form of an agreed-upon arbiter. in this case a Hsau. Hellenicus took precautions in case Kan Wu decided to back out of the deal. The Thaiatian was teleported into the speaker's home, along with 20 veteran assassins handpicked for the mission. They were to abduct but not kill 4 other speakers to guarantee the defenses would not be raised. Killing a speaker meant the power could be given to another party, so the speaker had to be kept alive. Plus, the Emperor wanted the speakers for the victory parade in Thaiatis City. Hellenicus gave the word at the appropriate time, and the Thaiatian agents moved out. They quickly abducted 2 speakers, as they weren't expecting armed assailants in their paradise. The other 2 escaped capture, one through blind luck, and the other defeated her abductors with magic. But the alarm was sounded, and the speakers were called to raise the defenses. Except Kan Wu kept her word. Even as the Alphatian airship appeared over the citadel and hundreds of knights from the Retibius air fleet disgorged, followed by dozens of Alphatian wizards, the speakers of the Radiant Citadel could do nothing. Then the airship docked and unleashed the Second Legion. The fight was over before it began. Without all the speakers present, the city couldn't raise its defenses. There was a town guard, but they were used to facing down thieves and conmen, not ranks of battle-hardened legionnaires backed by field artillery. A dozen archmages flew to the city's defense. Over 50 Alphatian wizards of equal power met them. When the dragon took flight to defend the city, she was riddled with bolts from the Thaiatian Scorpion war machines, dying in the opening minutes of the conflict. The forces moved methodically through the city, crushing all resistance. The shield-bearers, protectors of the city, fought with bravery, but they were outnumbered 50-1 just by the legionnaires. The Radiant Citadel fell within hours. The legionnaires were the best that Thaiatis had to offer, but they were not used to the menagerie that occupied the city. While the officers tried to avoid a slaughter, the troops put down anything they considered a threat. They left none alive from the supposedly rare half-demons that were quite ubiquitous in the city. With few exceptions, the Thaiatian troops purged the city of everything that wasn't human or demi-human. It was a massacre of the worst sort, but the empires weren't there to play nice. Once the slaughter stopped, the sacking began. Hellenicus instructed the troops to spare everyone in the Yinodu district per the agreement. However, the troops did slaughter their draconic overlords, though they later found out the dragon men were the leaders of the Yinodu, something Kan Wu had neglected to mention earlier. Eusebius honored the agreement when Kan Wu was brought to Thaiatis. She was given the imperial territories in the north-central region as a duchess loyal to Thaiatis, the region formerly known as Ispa. As far as the rest of the population of the Radiant Citadel, well, these are 2 empires that aren't known for their humanitarian attitudes. Most of the captives were reduced to serfs, involuntary laborers, unpaid Amazon night shift workers, Eastern Europeans, or to put it bluntly, slaves. Because that's what happens to unguarded utopias. They get conquered by people less friendly than them. It probably also explains why wizards won't touch Mystara with a 10-foot pole. Because Roman's gonna roam. With the loss of the speakers, the Spirit Guardians started the process of making the Citadel inhabitable. Or at least they would if they hadn't been killed for their gemstone bodies. According to Kan Wu, within a month, the Citadel would be uninhabitable. The 2 invading forces proceeded to strip the city to bare rock in 3 weeks. Alphatia claimed much of the Citadel's fabled library, while Thaiatis carted away the rubble of the gemstone buildings by the ton. The day that the Citadel was abandoned as a lifeless rock floating in the deep Ethereum, the now prefect, Antigone Hellenicus, received her triumph on the main thoroughfare in the Thaiatis city, proudly displaying the elven artifact that she was there for in the first place. One threat to Thaiatis' stability was removed almost by accident with the death of Heinrich Osterhaus, Count of Hadius and secret leader of the Storm Soldiers. When several of his group's members were caught in the new county of Yinodu, Osterhaus used his power to release them. Duchess Kan Wu demanded the men be returned for punishment, which the Count refused. Emperor Eusebius was already in a bad mood that day because of a lingering headache, and was forced to listen to the 2 nobles insult each other in the Senate chamber. When Eusebius ordered the men returned for judgment, Osterhaus openly insulted the Emperor. Annoyed, Eusebius ordered the Count taken to the Colosseum and thrown to whatever beast would most entertain the crowd. He then named General Haftigsberg the new Count of Hadius. Osterhaus was secretly the mortal incarnation of Thanatos, who let his divine arrogance get the best of him, and in doing so, significantly weakened his cause in Thaiatis. Through diplomacy, treachery, and brute strength, Eusebius has reversed the fortunes of Thaiatis. The empire recovered from its losses and even improved its relations with Alphatia by conquering or absorbing several smaller nations. Many of their former territories, while not reclaimed by Thaiatis, are at least back to being friendly with them. Whether or not the reversal has been halted remains to be seen. Thaiatis still has a reputation for treachery. Despite his numerous successes, there are multiple members of Thaiatis nobility that think they would be a far better emperor. Whether the reversal has been halted remains to be seen, but while Eusebius remains emperor, Thaiatis will not lack for ambition or treachery. When the last spell was cast, Empress Ariadne was a defeated woman. Her empire was intact. She had lost no territories, but her armies were mauled, her council of wizards was useless, and worse, her son was utterly incompetent. When the might of Alphatia made an all-out blitz to destroy Glantry City, they weren't just defeated, they were humiliated. Glantrian wizards proved superior in almost every regard. Their necromancers made the vilest wizards in Blackheart look like mere acolytes. The wizard princes had command of elementals, dragons, undead, constructs, and magics Alphatia had never seen before. Ironically, the failure of magic during the battle saved what remained of the Alphatian army, as they could retreat on foot to relative safety. The problems facing the Empire when the treaties were signed and the armies had returned were obvious. Xandor's complete lack of leadership had cost the nation almost 3/4 of its troops. Thyatis' methodical campaign to destroy the farms of Belisaria was complete. The island would need magical assistance to recover from the damage. Floating R was being rebuilt after an audacious assault by the Retibius air fleet left it in ruins, but the airship losses were almost complete. The Empress needed the Council of Wizards more than ever, and when needed the most, they were all busy trying to discover the Glantrian secrets that had been revealed during the war. She did what she could with her allies, and Norwald was pushed to increase the number of goods traded. They had a large number of new settlers from Glantrian dissidents, but planting new farms and building new trading posts took time. Ariadne could generally count on only 1/4 of the Council of Wizards. After the war, that number was less than 1 in 10. She had taken control of the nation of Sind, but they were worse off than just about anybody, having been strip mined by Hool for resources. She didn't have the numbers that Thyatis had to seize new territory. She could use magic to browbeat a nation into submission, but holding it would require troops. Troops she didn't have. She turned to magical studies to try to find a solution. If there was no one she could turn to in Mystara, other worlds could hold the key to Alphatia's restoration. She spent over a month in the private library of the Alphatian Palace. She found old magical formulas that hadn't been tested in centuries, enough material to blackmail entire nations, and designs for war machines that could have been useful before the war. But none of them were going to help restore Alphatia. Finally, almost accidentally, she knocked over a book that had sat on top of a shelf since before the first Landsfall day. The book was an account of an Alphatian explorer who gave a detailed report of a magical artifact that would let its user open portals into other worlds. Not just a gate, but you could send entire fleets through directly on top of a world no matter where in the multiverse it was. The journal even included instructions on how to use the artifact, the Key of Infinite Portals. The book gave the last known location of the key, in a fortress floating above a savage world known as Dukaksh. There was no guarantee the artifact was still there, considering the book's age and the key's very nature, but it was Ariadne's best chance to find an artifact to help her people. She didn't tell anyone of her discovery. The last thing she needed was Xandor to demand to lead the expedition. When she was finished learning everything she could, she called for her most reliable follower, Prince Haldimar of Hakan. He was skeptical about the assignment. Finding an ancient artifact was difficult. Finding one that had been lost for thousands of years was nigh impossible. But he had his orders and the Empress's blessing. He prepared the Princess Ark under the guise of a diplomatic mission to Miyashima. None of his crew knew their mission until the Ark cleared the world shield. This left them with no option but to fulfill the mission. The plan sounded simple. Use a gate spell to travel to the world of Dukaksh, infiltrate the fortress, find the artifact or a clue to its location, then either go to the next place or use the key to return to Alphatia. Haldimar chuckled to himself as how easy the plan sounded compared to what he knew was probably a wild goose chase at best. A few days later, he laughed at how simple the plan was. The Ark arrived over the planet without incident, found it guarded by hundreds of orc spelljammers. Only these were no ordinary orcs. They were a professional army called the Skro, complete with uniforms and well-trained formations. The Princess Ark was able to make its way to the fortress undetected because of its invisibility shield, where Haldimar and his most trusted companions made their way deep into the fortress. In a rousing adventure filled with danger and the most exciting thrills you've ever seen in Mystara, but are far too detailed to explain in a simple video. He acquired the key, much to his surprise. The prince headed straight to his bridge, and following the instructions given to him by the Empress, arranged the pieces of the key in order to return home. This did open a portal precisely as she explained, but for some reason it made the Ark completely visible, and the key sent out a pulse that alerted every spelljammer in the system. The Princess Ark raced through the portal with dozens of hostile ships in pursuit, even as Haldimar struggled to turn the key off and close the portal. His ship was in danger of flying itself apart as she dodged attacks from her pursuers. Haldimar finally closed the portal and tried to gain his bearings. The fact the ship still had atmosphere around him told him immediately they were not in Mystara space. To his horror, he saw the Ark flying straight at a large fleet of elven spelljammers, alerted to the artifact, and the massive Skro fleet approaching behind him. The Princess Ark screamed in protest as she dove to avoid the two fleets smashing into each other. It had several ships in pursuit. The key apparently was a beacon after being used. Again, the prince started fiddling with the artifact, trying to find out exactly why it wasn't working. He knew he had arranged the key exactly as instructed. Ariadne made him memorize the pattern before she let him leave her palace. He could hear his boltmen exchanging magical broadsides with the elven ships, and could feel the Ark wince in pain as ballista bolts and elvish spells hit home. He reset the key to the original configuration, and returned it to the pattern he had memorized and activated it again. This time, the Princess Ark transitioned to a place Haldimar knew well, the astral plane. At least here, he could plot a course back to Mystara in safety. Well, at least until he saw the giant elf hovering in space staring right at the Ark. Haldimar immediately tried to remember what kind of creature this was, as elven ships poured through the portal behind him, followed by Scrow spelljammers. Haldimar had heard of these creatures, but had never actually seen one. They were called Gogs, Gobs, Goffs, something like that. Definitely a G word. The elf demanded the key of infinite portals, as it was his rightful property, and Haldimar responded with a sharp turn and an order for flanking speed. The giant elf flew even faster, pulling a giant sword able to cut the Princess Ark in half with a single blow, and he prepared to strike, until an equally giant orc with only one eye slammed into the elf from above. The attack didn't do much harm other than stunning the elf and knocking off his amulet. As it fell to the deck, it shrank to human size in front of Haldimar, but he was too busy adjusting the key to notice while the elf and the one-eyed orc gobs went at it. The Princess Ark disappeared again, this time coming out of the portal above a floating rock skewered by a massive crystal. She came out of the portal dangerously close to the rock, and Haldimar could see a small city surrounding the crystal. He ordered a full stop before they collided, sending many of his men tumbling towards the bow and causing everything not tied down to fly off the Ark towards the city, including the elven amulet. The city surrounded itself with a magic barrier, which the Ark barely avoided. He saw the giant elf emerge from the portal, now enraged and disheveled, and screaming at the ship to stop. Haldimar adjusted the key quickly this time, trying to make sure he did it exactly as instructed by the Empress. Apparently he did it right, as the Princess Ark arrived within feet of its assigned dock in Sunsval, though the crew was startled by a loud thunk coming from the portal where the giant elf should have followed them. While Haldimar was off having fun exploring the cosmos, Ariadne got the news she hadn't expected but was ecstatic to hear. Her youngest son Tridorian a few years ago married a young Betelina's woman named Alara, who served at the Alphatian embassy in Thyatis City. She was a commoner without magic, but since Tridorian lacked any magic skills, Ariadne had given her blessing mainly because her son was the royal hostage to prevent war from breaking out, for all the good that did them. The two gave the Empress her first grandchild, a precocious little girl named Arachne. As her granddaughter came from parents without magical skills, Ariadne only thought of her granddaughter as someone she could spoil if Tridorian ever returned to the capital. When she was 5, Arachne accidentally activated her first wand. The child had arcane talent. Ariadne had a new heir. Upon hearing the news, the Empress ordered her grandchild to return immediately to the imperial palace. The official line was to protect the child from Thyacian plots, and so the Empress could spoil her new grandchild. In secret, she told her closest advisors about her plan to name her granddaughter the next Empress. Her inner circle consisted only of her daughter Eldrathilla and her father, the former Emperor Tilion. They trained the child to learn her first spell because a simple cantrip was all she needed to cast to be the next in line to the Alphatian throne. Haldimar arrived days later with the key of infinite portals, and that afternoon, Princess Arachne cast her first spell. Alphatia had a new heir apparent. The Empress knew Prince Xandar would be a problem. Her oldest son did not take setbacks lightly. He nearly burned down his flying castle when Ariadne stripped command of the armies from him during the war. She would give him a private estate where he could collect all the magical toys he was fond of, where he would want for nothing and have every whim catered for the rest of his days if he so chose. But she wasn't a fool and knew her son could be rash. She put up an anti-magic shell before calling for him to prevent him from burning down her study. She explained as gently as she could that Xandar would not be the emperor, that Arachne would rule when Ariadne stepped down whenever that would be. The Empress looked horrified as her son's face turned red from pure rage. She was grateful that she had placed the spell that would keep his spells at bay, and she could call for help from the guards just outside the doors. What she didn't plan for was Xandor choking the life out of her with his bare hands. With the anti-magic field gone, Xandor vaporized his mother's body and wished away the ashes so she could never be resurrected. The guards heard the loud casting, as did Xandor's sister Eldrathilla. She was unprepared for the enraged prince's fury as he turned the palace into an inferno, killing everyone he saw and destroying the journal that contained the instructions to the key of infinite portals. Xandor tore through the court looking for his niece, but no matter how many he burned alive with his spells, no one could tell him where she was. He saw the Princess Ark leaving with all speed and ordered his personal guard to pursue and bring him the head of his supposed rival and the annoying Haldimar. Before his castle could take to the air, the Princess Ark vanished, its invisibility field activated. The Alphatian Civil War took some time to get going. Xandor naturally declared himself emperor as his mother had left to explore the multiverse in her quest for immortality, taking his sister with her. Nobody dared question this proclamation, as asking too many questions risked becoming an ash pile on the floor. Meanwhile, Haldimar went from kingdom to kingdom trying to find supporters for Empress Arachne's claims. This was hard as Xandor was powerful, and most wizards didn't care who was on the throne as long as they were left to their own studies. He found his strongest ally in the most unlikely place. King Corwin of Ne'er-do-Well took over the Alphatian war effort against Thyatis after Xandor was stripped of power. He knew the danger the man possessed and knew he had to be stopped. But Xandor wasn't going to be defeated in the field of battle. Alphatia didn't have much of an army left thanks to the Mad Prince. Xandor's agents were watching the docks of Ne'er-do-Well, expecting Haldimar to seek out the king for assistance. His spies found the Princess Ark through magic and seized the ship, searching every bit of it before reporting back to Xandor that Arachne and Haldimar were nowhere to be found. As soon as this report was sent to the nearby Emperor, Haldimar sent a psychic command from a nearby building to the Skyworm Berilith to kill every one of Xandor's men on the Ark. He could hear her mad cackling as she did this with glee. Xandor needed Arachne dead, but he couldn't find her. With each atrocity he committed in seeking her out, support for her grew. His half-brother Erekol in Norwald had announced his open support for his niece. Xandor added his name to the list of people to be killed. His half-sister Mariella was beneath notice. He considered her an idiot incapable of conspiring against him. His grandfather was a recluse. He couldn't be bothered to come out of his studies even for a civil war. That left Arachne's father, Tridorian, currently the ambassador to Thyatis. Xandor made history by officially becoming the first Alphatian emperor to visit Thyatis City. Despite giving short notice, Emperor Eusebius made a grand spectacle to welcome his counterpart. Xandor pretended to care about the parade given in his honor, waiting for his audience with Eusebius. With the emperor and empress sitting on the throne, Xandor stood before them and rudely demanded the return of Tridorian on charges of sedition and treason unless Tridorian gave up his daughter. Eusebius responded, not bothering to get up, that Tridorian, in his many years living in the Thyacian palace, had bonded with the Taurian family. He was the closest thing Eusebius had as a brother, and he was not going to give up a man he considered family to a complete stranger that was obviously deranged. This was an outright lie. Eusebius cared nothing for Tridorian. Xandor knew this. Tridorian knew this. Eusebius knew this. Everyone in the throne room knew this. But no one was going to challenge the emperor. Even Xandor thought better of it, as when he looked around at the reactions of the assembled crowd, every guard, without exception, had their hand on their sword and was staring right at him. Eusebius was terrible at lying, but he was without equal when issuing threats. Meanwhile, at the Karameikos School of Magic in Krakatos, Master Terrari bounced his great-granddaughter on his knee, telling his students embarrassing stories about his daughter. He had taken advantage of the fact that no one knew he was the previous emperor of Alphatia, and nobody in his new adopted home seemed to care about his past. Xandor wouldn't even bother looking at what he considered a primitive backwater kingdom for a missing child. While the emperor flew up and down Alphatia looking for his niece, Terrari taught her new magics and cast spells on her to protect her from scrying. Arachne was a quick learner and seemed to grasp what Terrari told her. She would need a regent, and Terrari would do his best to ensure she would survive long enough to rule on her own. The actual battle for Alphatia didn't occur for months while claimants and their allies sought support. While Xandor searched in vain for the would-be empress, Haldimar and others loyal to Arachne approached those they could trust to gain their support. The civil war started when King Erekol of Norwald openly announced his support for his niece. This resulted in Xandor declaring Lernal the Swill, governor of Landfall and half-brother to Erekol, though on his father's side, no relation to Xandor, king of Norwald. Conflicts broke out over the distant province as the various settlers rallied to one flag or the other. The sudden start of hostilities cascaded through Alphatia as it became in vogue to support Xandor or Arachne. Even if the wizards had no interest in actively taking up arms, flags were set out to show which side had their loyalty, the red spider flag for the child empress, or the purple griffin for the eldest son. As news of battles came in from the field, support for the claimants could change overnight for the mercurial Alphatians. Entire countries started declaring their allegiance, which was often used as an excuse to settle ancient feuds. When Aragonsa declared for Xandor because he represented the old ways, Thrandural declared for Arachne so they could rekindle the lingering animosities between the two peoples. The massive line of fortifications along their border was put to use once more. Similarly, the nation of Bedouin flew Arachne's flag due to her mother hailing from its capital, Citadel. The government of Randall, who despised Thyatis more than any other Alphatian province, declared their support to Xandor. Both nations were known for their military prowess, and they demonstrated this in numerous clashes between the fortresses on their mutual border called the Randall Line. While the Randellian troops were well trained and provisioned, they lacked the numbers that the Betelines could muster. Xandor moved as many troops from the occupied nation of Sin as he could transport to compensate. This was a mistake he had made numerous times during the war, which led to weakening positions that couldn't afford to spare the troops. Because of the inadequate forces left behind to occupied Sind, that nation reestablished its sovereignty. But at least Randall was able to repulse the Betelines' push. Blackheart supplied all sorts of troops to Xandor's cause, though he didn't ask where they came from, or exactly what they were. Hordes of monsters, undead, and things left undescribed filled the ranks of his troops and brought him great victory for a while. The simple infantry of other nations would flee in terror rather than face the wrath of the innumerous abominations Blackheart fielded, primarily for research into future projects. But Arachne's forces strengthened because of Xandor's arrogance and despotic nature. Haven had the most significant number of influential commoners in the Empire, a status they knew would be stripped from them if Xandor ruled. Their opposition cost Xandor the Alphatian naval fleet and kept much of his forces guarding the Haven wall that separated the capital province of Vertalocht and Haven. Floating R was quick to side with Arachne, being the homeland of Prince Haldimar. Their fleet of airships was not completely rebuilt, but they had sufficient numbers to threaten Xandor's forces across the continent. Many Blackheart abominations were sent north to deal with floating R, but the airships easily held them at a distance. The war waxed and waned for months as only the forces with a personal stake in the fight kept up campaigns against their rivals. Xandor acted as emperor during this time from the palace in Sunsval, occasionally choosing to send orders to his armies and other times indulging in lavish parties for the nobles that lauded him as the rightful ruler, in hopes of future boons. He constantly sent messengers to Emperor Eusebius demanding the return of Tridorian, at least until Eusebius personally wrote back, asking the next messenger to waste his time to be first trained in the net and trident. While the battles in the war were every day, losses were surprisingly low. Often two armies met on the battlefield, and the wizards would lob spells at each other until one teleported away defeated, then their army would abandon the fight. Between the nations that joined because of old grudges, neither tried to invade each other because of the vast defenses built in the past specifically for situations like this. Castles bristling with troops would stare across a no-man's land at another castle at the other side of the border, also bristling with troops. Any attempt to attack a rival fortress would be obliterated by magic and siege weapons before they reached the halfway mark. Haldimar forced Xandor's hand by taking the fight directly to Sunsval. In the early hours of the 13th of Solomar, formerly the celebration of Empress Ariadne's birthday, the Princess Ark and half a dozen airships brazenly came out of the clouds over the palace and began firing on enemy positions. Xandor's flying castle engaged the fleet, which reformed into battle lines against it. For 2 hours, a pair of airships were blown from the sky, but the Ark and other airships eventually boarded the castle. But finally, the boarders secured Xandor's most prized possession. The Emperor couldn't be bothered to defend it as he had teleported away when Haldimar and his most capable officers landed in the palace to end the war in one fell swoop. Xandor relocated to his home province of Aquis to avoid further attacks. Haldimar might have control of the skies, but Aquis was under the sea. He locked down the city of Seashield, not allowing anyone to enter without the eldest son's permission. While there, he received news that Norwald was lost. Lernal didn't have the troops necessary to defeat Erekal, so he turned to the Heldonic Knights for assistance. The Knights won several battles until Erekal's combined army pushed them back to Lansfall. When Lernal demanded they get back out there and fight, they summarily executed him, simultaneously taking control of Lansfall and raising the city's average IQ. Erekal's army arrived to reclaim the city, but the Knights were dug in and the reinforcements had started arriving. The king allowed them to hold their prize for now. The war ended with a whimper rather than a cataclysmic battle. Xandor, frustrated with his setbacks, looked to exact revenge for at least one slight. He sent several of his best assassins to Thyatis to remind Eusebius that he was not to be trifled with. Rather than target the Emperor, his sons were the prey of the Alphatian killers. At least that was the plan, as all of them were found in the Imperial Palace, strangled by what appeared to be a curtain by the prince's bodyguards. Eusebius responded by declaring war on Aquis, not Alphatia. His declaration of war listed every other Alphatian territory by name and mentioned that he had no quarrel with any of them, but Xandor was now an enemy of Thyatis. The fleets were assembled, but King Finn of Ostland captured Xandor by convincing a guard to let him in under the guise of a Veslandic merchant, and then get the prince drunk and smuggle him back to his ship in a mead barrel. Empress Arachne I was crowned a week later in Sunsval. The child empress named a council of loyalist monarchs to serve as her regent, including her uncle Erekal, King Corwin of Ne'er-do-Well, and Queen Mylotendal of Haven. Her great-grandfather Tilian's secret remained with her at his request. She offered the empress's peace to all the nations allied against her, a complete pardon if they would swear loyalty. This was common practice in Alphatia. Most did almost immediately, seeing no point in continuing the war. Blackheart was the last to do so, agreeing just minutes before the offer expired. She was planning the trial of Xandor when a surprise visitor in the form of Stephania of Thyatis approached with an offer for a joint invasion of a paltry, undefended outpost in the ethereal plane that was quite wealthy. Arachne, after consulting her regents, agreed. A mutual operation taken by both empires would greatly improve relations between the nations. The invasion was quite successful, and Alphatia looted the city's impressive library and also returned with quite a bit of wealth and numerous slaves. Arachne then decided on Xandor's punishment. The rock that held the city was now devoid of life, but with some spells and enchantments, a private prison was created to provide Xandor everything he needed to survive in a manner built just for him, on a dead rock floating in the deep Ethereum until he died. As far as Haldimar, Arachne awarded the prince with the key of ultimate portals for his service, and tasked him to explore where he could for the benefit of Alphatia. Besides, he was the only man alive that knew how it worked. Sind is a nation that has left itself at a crossroads of its own making. They have been conquered twice in the last few years, being the first nation to fall in the War of the Master, and again when Alphatia occupied them afterwards, under the guise of keeping an eye on Hool. These occupations devastated Sind culture, as the master grabbed anyone he wanted to serve as cannon fodder in the war, regardless of caste. Alphatia was only there to gather resources. They didn't even bother enforcing caste laws. Something was going to break between the crippling poverty and the destruction of their normal way of life. The occupation by Hool was as brutal as you could imagine. The master's true target was Darakin, but he needed Sind's resources to do so. The Raja Daraja was known as a vain and ineffectual leader. When he realized he was being invaded, he'd already lost a quarter of his nation. The master's scorched earth tactics against any town that resisted caused the complete surrender of Sind by the Raja Daraja to save what little forces he had left. The master then put everyone to work in the mines or the fields to support his army. Caste didn't matter, with the exception of the Rashia caste. Sind's clerics and wise men were hunted down and exterminated to prevent their interference with the master's plans. High caste Hamaya were forced to till the fields with the untouchable Kuyala. Resistance was punishable by death. Slow work was punishable by death. Everything was punishable by death. Sind had a large population. Workers could be replaced. When Hool was defeated, Alphatia arrived in its place. It promised it was there to liberate Sind, not to occupy it. It then proceeded to occupy Sind. It wasn't a brutal conquest. The Alphatians let the Sindhi govern themselves. They were just there to grow food and mine ore for the empire. They paid the Sindhi workers. They didn't enforce Alphatian law and essentially left the people alone. The problem was they weren't rebuilding the shattered nation past what it was needed to transport goods and food. If a region wasn't crucial to the wizards, that region didn't receive help. Alphatia's civil war changed everything for Sind. The war for Xandar started to turn against him, so he began relocating troops from Sind back to the Empire. At first it was just reserve forces, then entire garrisons. Eventually there was just a skeleton crew left to make sure the food and minerals were transported, and even then, they were recalled. Sind was liberated, not through their actions or the intervention of an ally, but by simple neglect. The Raja Chandra Ulnervi found himself again the uncontested ruler of Sind. He tried to reinstate the caste system as it once was, but the crimes of the Hoolians made that impossible. The priest caste was all but gone. The warriors of the ruling caste would usually keep order, but they were almost eradicated during the war. This left most of the power to the lower castes, specifically the Prajaya, the working caste, and the Untouchables. But with the Alphatians gone, Ulnervi didn't have the troops to control the population. The lower castes demanded more power in the government, and when Ulnervi refused, a revolution broke out. The Sind Revolution was brief. There were far more lower classes than upper classes. Without warriors or clerics to pacify the Untouchables, they ran through the streets looting businesses and sacking government buildings. Ulnervi abandoned his throne almost immediately, relocating to the city of Kandraputra before abdicating. The revolution was a complete success. Now Sind is ruled by a parliament, with a minister-appointed head of state. It isn't efficient, but it works for the populace. Sind is still crippled from the war, even decades later. Darakin has help, but only once they had recovered. There was still some resentment from the formerly higher caste nobles, and the nation has a habit of descending into mob rule. Though the easternmost cities are considered stable, Sind's overall situation has its neighbors watching very closely. Under the ocean, the kingdom of the Tritons and Meru were safe from the wars above, but were still dealing with their own problems. Queen Tarovro is pressed on all sides by her enemies. On the surface, Minrathad harasses the sea people and is openly hostile to the Kana. The Devilfish are raising an undead army to crush Seaholm, and there's little she can do to stop it. Her army, while substantial, is badly outnumbered by the undead forces outside her borders. Worse, the most significant force in her army, the Sharkkin, are notoriously unreliable. She has no allies because of her distrust of surfacers, meaning she has to figure out how to save her kingdom, and she's rapidly running out of options. Or until an unusual opportunity came up with the start of hostilities between Minrathad and Festland. The Sea People were not friends with the Vestlanders. The northern nation was a stranger to the queen and her vassals. But they were fighting Minrathad and often winning. When the Kana approached the strangers, after some translation issues, the humans were keen to open up trading. They were new to the area, and they were trying to open up any market they could. The number of goods exchanged was minimal, but it showed to Rovra that at least these surfacers wouldn't attack her people on sight. Besides, the enemy of her enemy was her friend. She sent a portion of her army to aid the Vestlanders in their war. At first there were some problems. She didn't tell her erstwhile allies that she was supporting them. Tritons, Meru, and Kana showed up on the surface battles and started attacking Minrathadian shipping. There were several accidental casualties due to miscommunication on both sides, but eventually the commanders from Seaholm and Vestland started coordinating attacks to significant effect. In addition to military aid, the Tritons started showing the Vestlanders new shipping routes, allowing them to reach distant ports while avoiding hostile actions, at least on the surface. Many of these new routes led right over Devilfish territory. The Queen was rather curious how the Vestlanders could handle themselves against the undead hordes. The Northmen fought with brutality that the Tritons had never seen. While the guilds avoided combat at all costs to avoid damaging goods, Vestlandic sailors were warriors, one and all. The first encounter with the Devilfish tested the Vestlanders, but they fought off the ambush due to their Godar, or clerics, that accompanied every ship. Rather than try to find new routes, the Vestlanders next time just brought more Godar. The Triton forces started following Vestland ships, waiting for the humans to be attacked by undead from below before flanking their hated enemy. Soon the Devilfish started attacking Vestland's shipping out of spite more than anything else. The windows for these attacks was narrow, as once the ships got past a certain point, the Irendi navy would intervene, and the Devilfish would be completely outclassed. Queen Tarovra realized the Vestlanders were her trump card. She disliked them less than other humans, but she saw them as a tool. To stop the Devilfish, she needed to curtail their necromancy, which meant she needed to acquire one of the relics they used to control the undead on an unheard-of scale. She used spies to inform the Devilfish of a massive merchant fleet coming directly overhead in a few days, and then told the Vestlanders that the Devilfish were massing to wipe them out, so bring every ship they had. Her plan worked perfectly as the Northerners fought desperately to put down the swarms of skeletons and zombies swarming their ships. Their Godar blasted them to dust as best they could, but the undead were in the tens of thousands. All the while, the Triton forces held back, waiting for the right moment. In desperation, a powerful Godi of Thor called down a massive lightning storm into the ocean. One of the vampiric Devilfish high priests was caught in the blast, the one that controlled the Orb of Nyx. With his death, the orb sank to the bottom, right into the hand of her Triton scouts. At the cost of hundreds of human lives, Queen Tarovra had her weapon. The gnomish city of Serain was literally above it all during the wars that ravaged the known world. The city was technically neutral in both wars and never took part in any battles between Theatis and Alphatia. They didn't extend the same neutrality to Hool. More than once, the Serenian patrol craft accidentally dropped explosives on the Master's forces. It's not like the Hoolian forces could fight back. Some of their clerics did pose a threat to low-flying aircraft, and the gnomes quickly noticed, but their involvement never got past petty sniping, mainly because the city was never armed for war. It didn't have the weapons to fight the Master on a large scale. After the war, the city helped its allies rebuild the best it could. It was always dependent on resources from the ground, so it couldn't provide much in the form of material assistance. But it could give fast transportation better than anyone. If the Chancellor of Darrakan needed to meet with the King of Karameikos, a Serain cloud cutter could get him there in hours instead of a week. The gnomes made several of their flying craft available for use by their allies, leading to the construction of buildings and facilities in Darrakan, Karameikos, and the Shires to handle gnomish airships. Serain's contribution to the Western Alliance's recovery was small but vital. Serain was then called upon to support the retaking of Falun shortly after Darrakan had largely righted itself. The city had always promised their ground-based cousins any assistance in liberating their homeland, something the Gnomish Symposium held them to. When the time came, the inventors and investors that planned the invasion provided Serain's air force with all manners of upgraded weapons. The planes were kitted out with incendiary bombs, miniature death engines that looked like the Ak-Ak guns on the city, and new payloads to be dropped on the kobolds once they were flushed out from the mountains. The assault on Falun went well. Too well, it turned out. The ground forces marched into the caverns, with the kobolds unable to put up any defense against the superior gnomish technologies. When the kobolds fled from the caves on the opposite side of the invasion, the Serain gnomes hit them with everything they had, which turned out to be everything from poison gas to bombs that unleashed gargantuan fire elementals when they hit the ground. The pilots wanted to take their ancestral home back, but many were sickened at the sight of kobolds being dissolved by airdropped green slime. Serain dispatched 2 sorties during the attack, and when the Symposium called for a third, the pilots refused. The kobolds were routed. The battle was already a massacre. The Symposium was turning it into a feeding frenzy. After several terms, Mayor Keltander retired from service to spend time with his family. In the ensuing election, the chief librarian Matazumi surprised everyone with a convincing landslide. This was rather noticeable because he wasn't even running. The Skull Druge tried to refuse the position, but the laws prohibited him from resigning. Besides, he was the only creature in the entire city that not only read the 3,000 volumes that were Serain's Code of Laws, but he also understood them. He was released from his service as the librarian so he could perform his duties as mayor. Matazumi surprisingly pleased everyone due to his ability to work without tiring. He constantly complained about his job. He didn't sign up for this, and the city council didn't even understand the laws they were passing. He was elected a second time without campaigning for the position, and then a third time despite him actively campaigning for his opponent. He wasn't sure if it was because he was the best creature for the job or because nobody else wanted the job. The city thrived under his leadership. Tourism slowly rose, gnome-related disasters fell, and he removed over 1,000 volumes of redundant laws from the books. He began to look at the city's population as his people and felt good about himself, and then almost gagged and swore never to do that again. What can be said about the Fey folk in terms of mortal conflicts? For the most part, they didn't care. These were creatures that had been around since the beginning of the world. They had seen the rise and fall of Blackmoor, saw the elemental chaos as a thrill ride more than a natural disaster. A short war that didn't even last a decade was half a blink of an eye for most of them. A few were drawn into the conflict, mainly the Nunnehay, when the Master encroached on their territory. They taught him a hard lesson about what happens when the forest starts speaking Sylvan. The Fey that willingly took part in either war did it only because they thought it would be fun. They had their favorites, to be sure. If the Hulian forces had made it into Alfheim in any number, they would have been in for a rude surprise. The Green Knight Bregbethels guarded a lone bridge in the Shires against a column of humanoids on a lark. After a number of lengthy duels, he sent all their champions into the river below to stall their advance. He was never really in any danger. The fights took as long as they did because he wanted them to feel like they were trying. When New Angmor rose from the Broken Lands, many Fey and Sylvan races migrated to it. It was a mysterious force with discolored trees, strange new elves, and a curious magic that permeated it. It drew in the wilder Fey like moths to a flame. While they didn't have any magic spots like Alfheim, it would only be a matter of time. The only arch-Fey to claim it as her territory was Mob, Queen of Dreams and Nightmares. The blue-tinted trees reminded her of the night sky, a place she called home. Oberon saw the war as an opportunity. To be fair, he sees everything as an opportunity. During a jaunt to the city of Sigil, Robin Goodfellow learned of a powerful artifact that Oberon could use for a very specific task. The problem was getting it. Oberon had plenty of enemies, and if he started poking around the multiverse to find this artifact, his enemies, or worse, his wife, might notice his absence from the Fey court. To this end, he sent Ariel to place a relic capable of opening up portals to other worlds in a place where it could be found. While this relic could open gates to exact locations, it could only be activated in an order that Oberon had prearranged. Once that was done, he quickly wrote up a journal about his creation, and again had Ariel place it in the royal library in the Alphatian palace. When the Empress overlooked the book, he had to personally nudge it off the shelf to hit her in the head. Invisibly, of course. The relic worked precisely as planned, though he had to help the poor Alphatian captain sent to retrieve it by having several of his most trusted warriors open a path to the relic by secretly eliminating most of the Skrull guards in the fortress between the captain and the relic. The first portal opened directly in front of an elven fleet, and let everyone know where the captain was. Since Oberon previously had Krethilev name-drop the relic's power across the multiverse, he knew the vain god Larathian couldn't resist trying to seize it. The next portal put the airship right in front of Larathian, but also drew the attention of an orc god who hated the elf almost as much as Oberon did. This cat's paw knocked the artifact from Larathian's possession right onto the airship. But as soon as that happened, the relic activated again and the new position made the captain halt his ship upon transition, vaulting the artifact into a poorly defended city in the ethereal plane. Then Oberon's plan was all but done. He let it slip to a Thyatian cleric about the city's location and had Mob enter the dreams of one of the city's speakers to convince her to betray her adopted home and wait for the empires to do what empires do best. The artifact was brought back to Thyatis by the cleric in triumph, where Oberon later acquired it from the Church of Vanya in exchange for enabling their conquest of the ethereal city. Robin Goodfellow was right about the elven artifact. It fit Oberon's needs precisely. He placed it in the spot that he had carefully chosen years previously, and it worked perfectly. Maybe now his wife Titania would stop constantly complaining about the door creaking shut. Wasn't that exciting? Turns out it was all Oberon's fault. I wanted to wrap up a lot of loose ends and plot hooks of a time-sensitive nature. There were a lot of characters that were mostly dead in 1000 AC, and were still just mostly dead in the 1010 timeline. Now that I've gotten this out of the way, I can spend more time on my channel as I'm circling 10,000 subscribers and rapidly approaching that threshold daily. So until then, remember that time keeps on slipping into the future.